There are questions that wait for us in the dark hours. They arrive uninvited, settling into the quiet spaces between sleep and waking, refusing to let the mind rest. Some of these questions concern the ordinary mysteries of daily life. Others reach deeper, touching something ancient and half-remembered, like a word on the tip of your tongue that never quite arrives. And then there are questions about civilizations that vanished so completely, they left only whispers behind them. For more than 2,000 years, one name has persisted where others faded into silence. Not Troy, which was dismissed as myth until the ruins proved otherwise. Not El Dorado, which eventually dissolved into the realm of fantasy and ambition. This one is different. This one refuses to die. Atlantis holds a peculiar place in human consciousness, appearing in every generation with renewed urgency, as if each era discovers it anew and wonders why the world seems to have forgotten. What makes a story survive when empires crumble? What keeps a question alive across millennia, passed from culture to culture, translated into 100 languages, debated in Athenian forums and modern university halls alike? Perhaps it persists because people are credulous, prone to believing comfortable fantasies about golden ages and lost wisdom. That's the explanation you'll find in most textbooks: clean, simple, dismissive. But there's another possibility, one that sits less comfortably in the organized categories of accepted history. Perhaps Atlantis persists, not despite the absence of proof, but because something about the story resonates with a truth we've collectively forgotten. Perhaps entire generations across vastly different cultures have felt drawn to this particular mystery because memory works in strange ways, preserving echoes of events that official records have lost or never captured in the first place. The interesting thing about Atlantis isn't whether it existed. That's the question everyone asks, but it might be the wrong one. The interesting thing is why so much intellectual energy over so many centuries has been devoted to explaining it away. Why the insistence that it must be fiction, must be allegory, must be anything except what it claims to be? Why does the possibility make people uncomfortable enough to dismiss it without investigation? There are questions that wait for us in the dark hours. And sometimes, the most revealing thing isn't the answer we eventually find. It's noticing who doesn't want us to ask the question in the first place. Plato was not a storyteller. This is worth emphasizing because the conventional dismissal of Atlantis hinges on a fundamental misunderstanding of who Plato was and what he spent his life doing. For 4 decades, this man taught students in Athens to distinguish truth from illusion, reality from appearance, knowledge from mere opinion. His entire philosophical method was built on rigorous questioning, on stripping away comfortable assumptions to reach underlying truth. He wrote dialogues that systematically demolished weak arguments and exposed faulty reasoning. He was, by all accounts, the ancient world's most relentless advocate for intellectual honesty. So here's what doesn't make sense. This same man, this philosopher who built his reputation on critical thinking and truth-seeking, supposedly decided to invent an elaborate historical fiction and present it as fact. He supposedly created a detailed story about a lost civilization, complete with specific dates, precise measurements, and geographical coordinates, then inserted it into his philosophical dialogues without any indication that he was speaking metaphorically. And his students, his contemporaries, and the generations of scholars who followed him were all meant to understand that he was suddenly, uncharacteristically, making things up. Look at Plato's other works. When he uses allegory, he signals it clearly. The cave allegory is obviously symbolic. The myth of is explicitly framed as a tale about the afterlife. Plato knew how to distinguish between literal claims and figurative teaching. He had the vocabulary and the methodology to make that distinction clear. Yet when he writes about Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, he uses none of those signals. Instead, he frames it as history received from his ancestor Solon, who learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels. Athens in Plato's time wasn't some naive culture that accepted stories at face value. It was a society that valued historical accuracy, that kept records, that had living memory of recent wars and political events. The Athenians would have known if Solon had traveled to Egypt. They would have known their own lineage and history. Plato wasn't writing for credulous peasants. He was writing for educated Greeks who could verify or challenge his claims. And here's the detail that scholars rarely discuss. Plato had everything to lose and nothing to gain by inventing this story. His entire philosophical project depended on his credibility as a truth seeker. If he was caught fabricating historical accounts, his reputation would have been destroyed, his teachings dismissed, his school's credibility ruined. Would such a man risk everything for a story that served no clear philosophical purpose? He didn't mention Atlantis once in passing. He devoted significant portions of 2 major dialogues to it. He provided architectural specifications, described the political system, detailed the geography, gave precise dates. These are not the brushstrokes of allegory. These are the specifics of someone describing a place they believed was real, based on sources they considered reliable. Either Plato abandoned every principle he taught, or something more complex is happening here. Either this serious philosopher suddenly became a fraud, or we've been too quick to dismiss what he actually said. Listen to what Plato actually described. Not the vague mythology that popular culture remembers, but the specific, technical details that appear in his dialogues. Atlantis, he said, had a central island measuring 5 stadia across. Around it were concentric rings of water and land, each with precise measurements. The walls were plated with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum. There were bridges exactly 100 feet wide. Canals measured 300 feet across and 100 feet deep, extending 50 stadia to the sea. These aren't the poetic flourishes of myth-making. These are engineering specifications. Why would a philosopher inventing a moral fable about hubris need to tell you the exact width of the bridges? What narrative purpose do canal dimensions serve in an allegory? The geographical details are equally specific. Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Plato said, using the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. It sat in a true ocean, not the Mediterranean, which the Greeks considered more like a large enclosed sea. From this island, he explained, travellers could reach other islands, and beyond those lay an opposite continent. This description is remarkable because it contradicts what Greeks in Plato's time supposedly knew about the world. Their maps ended at Gibraltar. The Atlantic was mysterious, largely unexplored, the edge of the known world. Yet Plato describes a geography that sounds eerily like the Atlantic Ocean, with its island chains and, beyond them, the American continents. He mentioned hot and cold springs, both emerging naturally from the earth. He described sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled water throughout the island. He detailed metalworking facilities and shipyards capable of producing triremes, the advanced warships of the ancient world. He explained how the Atlanteans had domesticated animals and cultivated crops. Again, these are the observations of someone describing a functioning society, not creating a fantasy. And then there's the timeline. 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, Plato said, which places Atlantis around 9,600 BCE. For centuries, this date alone convinced scholars that the entire account must be fiction. No advanced civilization could have existed that far back in prehistory, they insisted. Humanity was barely emerging from caves. The very idea was absurd. Except, modern archaeology has since discovered that 9,600 BCE was a remarkable moment in human history. It marks the end of the last ice age, a period of rapid climate change and catastrophic flooding. It's when Göbekli Tepe was being constructed in Turkey, a site that shouldn't exist according to what we thought we knew about ancient capabilities. It's when multiple mysterious transitions occurred worldwide, as if something fundamental had changed. The details Plato provided weren't vague enough to be meaningless. They were specific enough to be tested, and the more we learn, the less absurd they seem. Plato didn't claim the Atlantis story as his own invention. He stated clearly that it came from his ancestor Solon, who had travelled to Egypt and learned it from priests at Sais. This attribution matters more than most retellings acknowledge. Solon wasn't a mythical figure. He was one of Athens' most respected lawgivers, a historical person whose existence and travels are well documented. Claiming Solon as the source meant Plato's contemporaries could verify or challenge the lineage of the story. It was a verifiable claim, not an appeal to untraceable tradition. The Egyptian priests themselves are the key to understanding why this story deserves consideration. Ancient Egypt maintained continuous civilization for over 3,000 years before Plato's time. Their temples weren't just religious centers. They were libraries, repositories of knowledge, with priesthoods that served as institutional memory keepers across generations. They kept meticulous records carved into stone, painted on papyrus, preserved with a care that few other ancient cultures matched. According to Plato's account, When Solon visited Egypt seeking historical knowledge, the priests told him something striking. "You Greeks are but children. You know nothing of the past." They explained that Greece suffered periodic catastrophes that destroyed records and forced civilization to begin again, losing its history in the process. Egypt, protected by the Nile's geography, had preserved memories that other nations forgot. This isn't just context for the Atlantis story. It's a meta-commentary on historical memory itself, on how knowledge is lost and why some civilizations remember what others forget. The priests were explaining why they knew things that Greeks didn't, establishing their credibility as sources for ancient history. And they weren't merely making claims. Egyptian records do contain references to foreign lands, ancient conflicts, and catastrophic floods. The Edfu texts describe a former age and speak of islands that were swallowed by water. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, describes a golden age when civilization was founded by beings of great wisdom. While these texts don't mention Atlantis by name, they wouldn't. Since that's a Greek name for a foreign place, they establish that Egyptians did maintain traditions about lost lands and ancient civilizations predating their own. Here's what makes this interesting. If the Egyptian priests were simply flattering Greek visitors with impressive tales, why would they maintain consistent accounts over generations? Multiple Greek visitors over centuries reported learning similar stories from Egyptian sources. Consistency across time suggests genuine tradition, not improvised fiction. The Egyptian connection transforms Atlantis from a single philosopher's claim into something more substantial. It suggests an ancient source, maintained by a civilization known for record-keeping, describing events from deep prehistory. Whether those records were accurate is another question. But the chain of transmission appears to be real. Someone told Solon something, and he believed it enough to bring it back to Greece, where it eventually reached Plato's attention. There's a story that humanity tells itself over and over in languages that never touched, in cultures separated by oceans that supposedly were never crossed. More than 200 distinct traditions around the world preserve detailed accounts of catastrophic floods. This number alone invites the obvious explanation. Humans settled near water. Floods are common natural disasters, so flood stories would naturally emerge independently wherever people lived. Clean, rational, requiring no uncomfortable implications about ancient connections or shared memories. But look closer at what these stories actually say. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh doesn't just describe a flood. It describes a civilization of great wisdom that existed before the waters came, knowledge that was nearly lost when the deluge swept across the world. Hindu texts speak of Dwarka, a magnificent city of advanced architecture and engineering, submerged beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic event. Chinese legends preserve memories not merely of flooding, but of lost kingdoms and ancient ages that ended in water. Mesoamerican cultures describe previous worlds, previous suns as they called them, each destroyed in turn, several by floods that swept away everything that came before. The pattern goes deeper than water rising and people drowning. These stories share troubling specifics. Many describe beings of advanced knowledge, sometimes called gods or teachers or ancestors, who possessed wisdom that was lost when the floods came. They speak of sudden catastrophe, not gradual rise. They mention survivors who preserved fragments of the old knowledge and carried it to new lands. They often place these events in the distant past, in times before the current age of humanity. Why would primitive peoples, struggling to survive, invent elaborate stories about advanced civilizations being destroyed? If you're creating mythology to explain the floods you experience in your own time, why set the story in a distant golden age of sophistication that was lost? The academic answer is that humans naturally romanticize the past, imagining better times before their own struggles. Perhaps. But romanticism doesn't typically include engineering specifications and technological details. Some of these flood accounts describe astronomical events accompanying the disaster: darkness covering the sky, fire falling from above, the earth shaking in ways it never had before. Geological descriptions that sound less like embellishment and more like observation. Independently, cultures describe phenomena that modern catastrophe theory has only recently begun to recognize as geologically plausible: rapid sea level rise, cosmic impacts, volcanic events occurring simultaneously with flooding. The question becomes, which explanation requires fewer assumptions? That 200 separate cultures independently invented nearly identical stories about advanced civilizations destroyed by floods, coincidentally placing them at similar time periods in deep prehistory, coincidentally describing similar accompanying phenomena, and coincidentally preserving these accounts through millennia of oral tradition with remarkable consistency. Or that something happened, something catastrophic enough that the memory persisted even as the details fragmented and scattered across migrating populations, transforming through retelling, but retaining a core of shared experience. Collective memory is a strange thing. Trauma preserves itself in ways that ordinary experience doesn't. And if humanity experienced something truly catastrophic at the end of the last ice age, if rising waters swallowed entire coastal civilizations, if survivors fled to inland regions carrying stories of what was lost, those memories might persist longer than any written record, encoded in the myths we still tell when we gather to make sense of where we came from. The stories aren't just about floods in general. Specific cultures preserve specific accounts of specific places that sank beneath the waves. These aren't vague references to ancient disasters. They're detailed traditions about cities, kingdoms, entire civilizations that the ocean swallowed. Take Dwarka. Hindu tradition describes it as the legendary city of Krishna, a metropolis of magnificent architecture, sophisticated engineering, prosperous trade. The texts say it was swallowed by the sea after Krishna's death. For centuries, scholars treated this as pure mythology, a religious story with no historical basis. Then marine archaeologists discovered extensive underwater structures off the coast of Gujarat, India. Stone constructions at depths, suggesting they were built when sea levels were lower. Dating remains controversial, but the structures exist. The myth had pointed to something real. The Welsh preserved legends of Cantrea Gwaelod, a prosperous lowland kingdom protected by seawalls and sluice gates. According to the stories, the kingdom was fertile and wealthy until the gates were left open during a storm, flooding the entire region. The parallels are striking. Advanced hydraulic engineering, maritime culture, sudden inundation. The legends even specify location: Cardigan Bay, where bathymetric surveys have revealed submerged forests and what might be ancient structures beneath the water. Japanese traditions speak of Ryugu-jo, an underwater palace kingdom. Polynesian cultures across the Pacific preserve memories of Hiva, a homeland that disappeared beneath the waves, from which ancestors fled to populate the islands. The Hopi of North America describe previous worlds destroyed when humanity grew corrupt, with small groups of survivors escaping to establish the next age. Basque legends mention Atlantica. Berber traditions from North Africa describe an island in the Atlantic that sank. What makes these accounts intriguing isn't merely that they mention sunken lands, it's the details they share. These were advanced societies, not primitive settlements. They possessed knowledge and technology that was lost when they were destroyed. The destruction came suddenly, catastrophically. Survivors scattered, carrying fragments of the old ways to new locations. These specifics repeat across cultures that supposedly never communicated. The standard academic response is to dismiss these as purely mythological, products of human imagination, rather than historical memory. Floods happen, cities are abandoned, people create stories to explain ruins or to romanticize their origins. All true, but then underwater archaeology starts finding things. Not just Dwarka, but submerged settlements in the Black Sea, dating to when it was a freshwater lake before catastrophic flooding from the Mediterranean. Underwater structures off Japan's Yonaguni Island that some researchers argue show signs of carving and construction. Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece, an entire Bronze Age city preserved beneath the waves. Each discovery forces reconsideration of stories previously dismissed. If this myth pointed to real ruins, what about the others? If these people preserved accurate geographical memories through oral tradition, what else might they have preserved? Perhaps ancient peoples weren't primarily creating fantasy. Perhaps they were doing what humans do after trauma: remembering, preserving, passing down accounts of what was lost. The details might have shifted over centuries of retelling. Names might have changed as languages evolved. But the core memory, the essential truth that something existed and then was gone, taken by water, might be more historically accurate than comfortable scholarly consensus prefers to acknowledge. The ocean covers most of Earth's surface. The ocean hides what we haven't looked for, and we've barely begun looking. Modern skeptics often claim that Plato invented Atlantis whole cloth, that no other ancient source mentions it, that his contemporaries recognized it as fiction. This narrative is comforting. It's also demonstrably false. Ancient scholars who lived closer to Plato's time, who had access to libraries and sources now lost to us, didn't treat Atlantis as obvious fiction. They debated it, investigated it, referenced it in their own works. Some accepted it as historical, others questioned details. But the immediate dismissal we see in modern scholarship simply didn't exist in the ancient world. Crantor lived about a generation after Plato. He was a respected philosopher, a serious scholar, not someone prone to chasing fantasies. According to later sources, Crantor travelled to Egypt specifically to verify the Atlantis account. He reportedly saw columns in an Egyptian temple that recorded the story Plato had written about. We don't have Crantor's original work, lost along with so much of ancient literature when libraries burned and empires fell. But the fact that a reputable scholar considered the account worth verifying suggests his contemporaries took it seriously. Strabo, the Greek geographer, whose work shaped ancient understanding of the known world, discussed Atlantis in his writings. He didn't dismiss it as fiction. He debated its location and likelihood, treating it as a geographical question rather than a mythological one. Pliny the Elder, whose natural history compiled knowledge from hundreds of sources, mentioned islands that had disappeared in the Atlantic, land changes that suggested the geography of the world was not fixed. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century, described an island continent beyond the Atlantic, a great landmass that ancient peoples had visited. Proclus, a 5th century philosopher, stated directly that Atlantis was real and cited multiple historical sources supporting its existence. Marcellus wrote about Ethiopian traditions of an island in the Atlantic that had been destroyed. These weren't fringe figures inventing pseudo-history. They were respected scholars and historians working with sources and traditions that have since vanished. What's notable is what's missing from ancient literature. There's no record of Plato's contemporaries calling him out for obvious fabrication. Athens in his time wasn't some naive culture that accepted any claim uncritically. Philosophical schools engaged in vicious intellectual combat, eagerly tearing down weak arguments and false claims. Plato had rivals, critics, opponents who would have jumped at the chance to expose him as a fraud. Yet we find no ancient text accusing him of inventing Atlantis. The silence is suggestive. Even the structure of Plato's account raises questions. The Critias dialogue ends abruptly, incomplete. Plato died before finishing it. Why begin an elaborate fiction you don't complete? If Atlantis was merely a device for philosophical argument, why the unfinished narrative? It reads more like someone working from source material they hadn't fully organized, or perhaps like someone who realized the account was too controversial to complete. Ancient historians and geographers, who were actually in positions to verify or disprove Plato's claims, treated Atlantis as a legitimate historical question. They had access to sources we've lost. They lived in a world where institutional memory still connected to older traditions. Modern scholars, separated by millennia and multiple destructions of ancient libraries, declare with certainty that Atlantis is fiction. The question worth asking: why are we more certain than they were? What do we know that they didn't? Or is it possible we've forgotten what they remembered? Maps don't lie the way stories can. Maps are practical tools, created for navigation, for finding your way from one place to another. When a map shows something that shouldn't exist, it demands explanation. And there are maps, quite a few of them, showing things that shouldn't be there according to everything we think we know about ancient exploration and geographical knowledge. The Piri-Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, shows the coastline of South America with remarkable accuracy for its time. That's interesting, but not impossible to explain. What's impossible to explain is that it also shows Antarctica's coastline in detail, and shows it without ice, as it would have appeared thousands of years ago before glaciation covered the continent. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. The ice sheet covering it formed over 10,000 years ago. Yet here's a 16th century map, depicting both the continent's existence and its ice-free topography. Piri-Reis stated clearly in notes on the map that he compiled it from older sources, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great and beyond. He wasn't claiming to have discovered these places himself. He was copying from maps that already existed, maps that have since been lost. The Orontius Phineus map of 1000 531, shows similar impossible knowledge. Antarctica again, depicted in detail, with mountain ranges and coastlines that match the actual geography hidden beneath miles of ice. How did Renaissance cartographers know the shape of a continent that wouldn't be mapped until the 20th century, using technology that could see through ice? Medieval maps consistently show mysterious islands in the Atlantic. Antillia, High Brazil, St. Brendan's Island appear on chart after chart for centuries. Then, as exploration improves, these islands disappear from maps. The standard explanation is that they were mythical, products of sailors' imagination or cartographic copying of errors. But some of these islands appear at locations corresponding to modern undersea plateaus and formations, features that were above water during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower. Portolan charts, used for Mediterranean navigation, show coastline accuracy that seems advanced for their supposed time of origin in the 13th century. Renaissance cartographers like Mercator explicitly stated they were copying from ancient sources, particularly knowledge preserved from the Library of Alexandria before its destruction erased so much of ancient learning. The pattern suggests ancient mariners mapped the world more extensively than mainstream history acknowledges. That knowledge was partially preserved through copying, sometimes accurate, sometimes degraded, but retaining elements of geographical understanding that shouldn't have existed. Maps showing ice-free Antarctica require source material from before the ice sheets formed, which means before 10,000 years ago, which means from a time when human civilization supposedly consisted of primitive hunter-gatherers incapable of oceanic navigation or continental mapping. If ancient peoples knew things they shouldn't have known, what else did they know? Maps might be the most objective evidence we have. Less prone to mythological embellishment than oral traditions, less easily dismissed than legends, maps are practical documents. They exist because someone needed to find their way. And if those maps show places that were lost beneath ice or ocean, they might be pointing to knowledge from a civilization sophisticated enough to explore and chart a world that no longer exists. Plato was specific about location. Not vague, not metaphorical, but geographically explicit in a way that's uncomfortable for those who prefer Atlantis to remain safely in the realm of allegory. He said, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In the ancient Greek world, everyone knew what that meant. The pillars were the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Europe and Africa where the Mediterranean ends and something larger begins. They marked the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the civilized sea and the mysterious outer ocean. Plato made another distinction that often gets overlooked. He described Atlantis as being in a true ocean, explicitly contrasting it with the Mediterranean, which the Greeks considered more like an enclosed harbour. This wasn't poetic language. This was geographical description, placing Atlantis in what we now call the Atlantic Ocean. The name itself is suggestive, though which came first, the ocean or the legend, remains debated. He described Atlantis as an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. By Greek understanding, that meant a landmass of substantial size. Whether this was literal or referred to sphere of influence is unclear, but the scale suggested was significant. Then Plato added another detail that's almost more remarkable. From Atlantis, he said, travelers could reach other islands, and beyond those islands lay an opposite continent, a landmass across the ocean. Read that description again, an ocean with islands scattered across it, leading to a far continent on the other side. Plato wrote this in 360 BCE. Greek geographical knowledge supposedly ended at Gibraltar. The Atlantic was largely unexplored, mythical, the edge of the world. Yet Plato describes a geography that sounds precisely like the Atlantic Ocean, with its island chains and, beyond them, the Americas. How did he know there was a continent across the Atlantic? Coincidence? Lucky guess? Or was he working from sources that knew more than they should have? Modern scholars have spent centuries trying to relocate Atlantis anywhere except where Plato placed it. Santorini, Crete, Malta, Sicily, Cyprus, Troy. Every Mediterranean theory requires the same fundamental step, ignoring what Plato actually said about location. These theories point to real civilizations that experienced real catastrophes, and that's appealing. Tangible evidence, known history, comfortable explanations. But none of them are beyond the Pillars of Hercules. None are in the true ocean. They're all in the Mediterranean that Plato explicitly distinguished Atlantis from. Why work so hard to reinterpret clear geographical statements? If Plato meant Crete, he would have said Crete. The Greeks had names for Mediterranean locations. They knew their own sea intimately. Why would Plato invent elaborate fiction about the Atlantic when he meant the Mediterranean? Unless the statements aren't fiction. Unless they're too uncomfortable to accept literally, because accepting them requires reconsidering everything we think we know about ancient geography, ancient capabilities, and what was possible before the Ice Age ended. If we take Plato seriously, Atlantis lies somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, and we've barely begun looking there. There's a place in the mid-Atlantic where the ocean floor rises dramatically from the abyss. Not gradually, but in a massive geological formation that creates a plateau miles across, lifting toward the surface from depths that would crush anything living. The Azores Islands are the visible peaks of this formation, 9 volcanic islands breaking through the waves. But beneath the water, the plateau extends far beyond what's visible, a submerged landmass that was considerably larger when sea levels were different. During the last ice age, global sea levels sat roughly 400 feet lower than today. Massive ice sheets locked up water that now fills the oceans. The Azores Plateau, partially exposed then, would have formed a substantial landmass, possibly a large island or archipelago. The positioning is precise in a way that seems almost too convenient. The Azores sit roughly equidistant between Europe and Africa on one side, the Americas on the other. Exactly where Plato described Atlantis, a stepping stone between continents, positioned to reach other lands. Bathymetric surveys that have mapped the underwater topology reveal unusual features. Some researchers claim to see geometric patterns in the formations, though these remain controversial and disputed. What's not disputed is the geology. The Azores sit on the mid-Atlantic ridge, the seam where tectonic plates pull apart, one of the most geologically volatile zones on Earth. Volcanic activity, earthquakes, rapid land changes, all happen here regularly. If you wanted to design a location where an island could be catastrophically destroyed, where land could sink or be buried under ash, where tsunamis could sweep everything away, you'd describe something like this region. The islands themselves have a history of emerging and submerging. New volcanic islands have appeared in historical times. Others have sunk or been eroded away. The geology suggests rapid changes are not just possible but routine here. Samples taken from the plateau have revealed beach sand and shallow water fossils at depths that indicate these areas were once at or near sea level, then sank or were submerged as waters rose. The timeline matches. The end of the Ice Age, around 9,600 BCE, Plato's exact dating for Atlantis's destruction, saw catastrophic geological instability. Sea levels rose rapidly, not gradually. Meltwater pulses dumped enormous volumes into the ocean within decades or centuries. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests cosmic impacts during this period, triggering tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. If a civilization existed on the Azores Plateau during that time, it would have faced perfect conditions for annihilation. Rising seas, volcanic destruction, seismic violence, possible impact-generated tsunamis. This isn't proof. The Azores theory is speculation, informed speculation perhaps, but still speculation. What makes it compelling is how many separate pieces align. The geography matches Plato's description. The geology provides mechanisms for catastrophic destruction. The timeline corresponds precisely. The location could have supported civilization during the Ice Age, then been submerged as waters rose and the plateau sank. And we've barely explored it. Deep-sea investigation is expensive, technically challenging, requiring specialized equipment and ships. The Azores Plateau lies largely unexplored, despite being one of the most significant underwater formations in the Atlantic. What lies beneath 3,000 feet of water and thousands of years of sediment, no one can say with certainty, because no one has looked properly. The Atlantic Ocean floor isn't uniform. Scattered across it are dozens of underwater mountains, plateaus, and banks, formations that rise from the deep and, in many cases, were once above water. The Horseshoe Seamounts lie west of the Strait of Gibraltar, a chain of underwater mountains discovered through sonar mapping. What makes them interesting is their tops, flat and level in ways that suggest wave erosion, features that form when islands are exposed to surf. These were islands once. Then they sank, or the sea rose, or both. The Ampere and Seine seamounts show similar characteristics. Flat-topped formations at depths that would have been islands during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower. Geological evidence suggests some of these were exposed land as recently as 12,000 years ago, exactly the time frame we keep encountering. Any settlements built on them would now lie hundreds of feet underwater, buried under sediment, effectively erased from the archaeological record. Move west toward the Americas, and you find the Bahama Banks, massive shallow water platforms that were exposed as substantial landmasses during lower sea levels. The Caribbean basin contains similar formations. One location off Bimini has generated decades of controversy. Underwater rock formations that some researchers claim show evidence of construction, arranged blocks that look too regular to be natural. Mainstream archaeology attributes them to natural beach rock formation, geological processes, creating linear patterns that mimic construction. The debate continues, unresolved, representing a broader question about how we distinguish natural formations from ancient artificial structures underwater. The Sargasso Sea region, that mysterious zone of calm water and floating seaweed in the central Atlantic, sits atop an unusual concentration of seamounts and underwater plateaus. The Bermuda Plateau extends beneath this area, another formation that was partially exposed during the Ice Age. Deep-sea archaeology in these locations has been minimal. The technical challenges are substantial. Depths requiring remotely operated vehicles, sediment covering any structures, the expense of mounting proper surveys. Most underwater archaeology focuses on shallow coastal areas or historical shipwrecks, not deep-water exploration of submerged Ice Age landscapes. The broader point is this: significant portions of the Atlantic floor that were habitable land during the Ice Age remain virtually unexplored. We've mapped the ocean floor from satellites, yes, but mapping topology and conducting archaeological investigation are entirely different endeavors. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly when we've barely looked. Coastal shelves worldwide have yielded evidence of ancient human habitation. The North Sea, once the dry land of Doggerland connecting Britain to Europe, has produced artifacts and remains from the hunter-gatherers who lived there before flooding submerged their world. The Black Sea contains settlements from when it was a freshwater lake, before catastrophic inundation from the Mediterranean. Pavlopetri off Greece, extensive underwater ruins off India's coast, numerous sites proving that submerged settlements exist and can preserve for millennia. The Atlantic might hold similar surprises. Multiple underwater plateaus and banks were exposed during the Ice Age. Any advanced civilization developing along those coasts would now be deep underwater, accessible only through expensive deep-sea exploration that hasn't been seriously attempted. We've explored roughly 3% of the deep ocean floor. What lies beneath the other 97%? No one knows. And that's the problem. The Santorini theory is seductive. It offers everything mainstream archaeology prefers: a real civilization, tangible ruins you can visit, a documented catastrophic volcanic eruption, comfortable dates within historical memory. The Minoan culture on Crete and surrounding islands was genuinely advanced for its time, with sophisticated architecture, elaborate art, impressive engineering. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted with devastating force. The explosion generated tsunamis, buried settlements in ash, potentially contributed to Minoan decline. Here's a lost advanced civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe. Could this be Plato's Atlantis? The appeal is obvious. But the problems are equally obvious if you actually read what Plato wrote. Santorini lies in the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The timeline is wrong by 8,000 years. The eruption didn't destroy Athens, which in Plato's account fought against Atlantis before both were destroyed. The scale doesn't match. Crete and Santorini were not larger than Libya and Asia combined by any reasonable interpretation. The Minoans were maritime traders. Yes, but they weren't described as possessing the global reach Plato attributed to Atlantis. To make Santorini fit, you must reinterpret nearly everything Plato said. The location becomes metaphorical. The dates become confused or exaggerated. The descriptions become amalgamations of different places. You're no longer taking Plato's account seriously. You're using pieces of it to explain something else entirely. Other Mediterranean theories face identical problems. Malta has impressive ancient megalithic temples, but it's not beyond the Pillars. Sardinia has mysterious Bronze Age structures, but the geography doesn't match. Sicily, Cyprus, Troy, various locations around the Mediterranean all have ancient ruins and histories of catastrophe. None of them fit Plato's geographical description. All require ignoring his explicit statements about location. Why do these theories persist despite their fundamental problems? Because they're comfortable. They keep Atlantis within known history, within explored geography, within the Mediterranean that archaeologists have studied extensively. They don't require accepting controversial ideas about advanced Ice Age civilizations. They don't challenge the established timeline of human development. They let scholars say Plato was describing something real, while avoiding the uncomfortable implications of taking him literally. There's a psychological appeal to theories that don't upset existing paradigms. Academia, like any human institution, resists ideas that would require rewriting textbooks, reconsidering established narratives, admitting that previous certainty was premature. Mediterranean theories allow that resistance to feel justified. They're compromise positions. Plato wasn't entirely making it up, but he wasn't being literal either. But here's what makes these theories ultimately unsatisfying. Plato was Greek. He knew the Mediterranean intimately. Greek civilization was Mediterranean civilization. If Plato meant to describe Crete, or Santorini, or any other Mediterranean location, he had names for these places. He could have simply said where he meant. The Greeks had detailed knowledge of their own sea, its islands, its history. Why would Plato create elaborate fiction about the Atlantic Ocean, about a true ocean beyond the pillars, about an opposite continent, when he actually meant familiar Mediterranean geography? The counterargument is that Atlantis was pure allegory, a philosophical device, so location didn't matter. But allegories don't typically include architectural specifications, precise measurements, detailed geographical coordinates, and specific dates. Those are the elements of someone describing a place they believe existed. Mediterranean theories ultimately require more suspension of disbelief than Atlantic theories. They require believing Plato said one thing, but meant something entirely different. That what appears to be geographical description was actually coded metaphor that only modern scholars have decoded, while ancient readers somehow missed the signals. It's possible, but it's not simple, and it's not obvious, and it raises more questions than it answers. Picture Earth 12,000 years ago. Not fundamentally different, but changed in ways that would make the geography unrecognizable. Sea levels sat approximately 400 feet lower than today. 400 feet. That's not a minor variation. That's the difference between dry land and deep ocean, between habitable coastline and underwater wasteland. The reason was ice. Continental glaciers miles thick, covering Canada, Scandinavia, parts of Asia. All that water had to come from somewhere, and it came from the oceans, locked up in frozen masses that wouldn't melt for thousands of years. What this meant practically was that coastlines extended far beyond where they are now. The continental shelves, those gently sloping underwater plains that surround the continents, were exposed. And continental shelves are enormous. The North Sea between Britain and Europe wasn't a sea at all. It was Doggerland, a vast plain with rivers and forests and, we now know, human settlements. Britain wasn't an island. You could walk from London to Amsterdam without getting your feet wet. Indonesia's scattered islands were connected as Sunderland, a subcontinent. Alaska and Siberia joined at the Bering Land Bridge. The Persian Gulf didn't exist as a body of water. It was a river valley. The Mediterranean's coastline extended miles beyond its current shores. And the Atlantic, that true ocean Plato mentioned, had exposed plateaus and banks and formations that are now hundreds of feet underwater. Here's what this means for the Atlantis question. Human civilizations develop on coasts. They always have. Coasts provide access to marine resources, enable trade, offer temperate climates and fertile land where rivers meet the sea. Modern archaeology looks for ancient settlements and finds them inland or on current coastlines. But those aren't where Ice Age people would have built their cities. They would have built on the Ice Age coastlines, which are now submerged, buried under sediment, completely inaccessible without expensive underwater exploration. We're finding evidence of this now, slowly. Underwater ruins off India's coast where Dwarka supposedly stood. Extensive settlements in the Black Sea from when it was a freshwater lake before the Mediterranean broke through and flooded it catastrophically. Doggerland has yielded artifacts and tools, and remains of sophisticated hunter-gatherers who lived in a landscape that no longer exists above water. Each discovery forces reconsideration of what we thought we knew. Estimates suggest over 20 million square kilometers of formerly habitable land now lies underwater. That's larger than South America. An entire continent's worth of potential settlement area, submerged, unexplored, written off by archaeology because investigating it is technically difficult and expensive. Mainstream archaeology has focused almost entirely on sites that are above water today. The sampling bias is staggering. We're drawing conclusions about ancient human capability based on whatever happened to survive in locations that stayed dry. Everything that was built on coasts, which is where most advanced settlements would logically be, is now gone from easy view. Plato placed Atlantis at the end of the Ice Age, right when these massive coastal areas existed and were about to be catastrophically flooded. That timeline seemed absurd for centuries. Now it seems prescient. The coastlines were there. The land was there. The question is whether anyone built anything significant on it before the water returned and erased the evidence. Sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age wasn't gradual. This matters because the standard image of slowly rising water over thousands of years suggests something manageable, something coastal populations could adapt to by moving inland. That's not what happened. The ice sheets collapsed in surges, in catastrophic pulses that dumped enormous volumes of water into the oceans within decades, possibly within years in some cases. Meltwater Pulse 1b occurred around 9,600 BCE. Read that date again. Plato's exact timing for Atlantis' destruction. Geological evidence from sea level markers and coral reefs shows that during this pulse, oceans rose by 50 to 65 feet within a few centuries at most, possibly much faster. 50 feet of sea level rise doesn't mean water slowly creeping up beaches. It means coastal cities inundated, river valleys flooded miles inland, populations displaced or drowned with nowhere to retreat fast enough. The mechanisms were violent. The Laurentide ice sheet covering North America began collapsing. Ice dams holding back glacial lakes larger than any modern lake suddenly failed. When glacial Lake Missoula's ice dam broke, it released water at 10 times the combined flow of every river on Earth today. The flood carved out the channeled scablands of Washington state in a matter of days, moving boulders the size of houses, scouring bedrock, reshaping hundreds of square miles of landscape. That happened repeatedly. Similar catastrophic releases occurred from other glacial lakes in North America, Siberia, Europe. Then there's the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Growing evidence suggests Earth passed through a field of cosmic debris around 10,900 BCE. Multiple impacts from fragmented cometary material. The evidence appears in sediment cores worldwide, a layer containing nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, platinum at elevated levels, carbon spherules indicating intense burning. The timing matches sudden extinction of Ice Age megafauna, widespread burning evident in the geological record, and the onset of the Younger Dryas cold period. Impacts would have triggered immediate devastation. Tsunamis from ocean impacts, shockwaves from land impacts, widespread fires from heated ejecta raining down. But they would also have destabilized the ice sheets, accelerating the melting process, contributing to the rapid deglaciation and catastrophic flooding that followed. Consider what this meant for any coastal civilization. Rising seas, yes, but also earthquakes, as the Earth's crust adjusted to the removal of billions of tons of ice weight. Volcanic eruptions triggered by the same crustal stresses. Tsunamis from submarine landslides as continental shelves collapsed under changing weight distribution. The Storegga slides off Norway's coast during this period generated tsunamis that devastated coastlines as far as Scotland and Denmark. Global flood myths describe catastrophic waters accompanied by fire from the sky, darkness, shaking Earth. These details appear in cultures separated by oceans. Perhaps they're not embellishment. Perhaps they're accurate descriptions of what people experienced during a period of planetary-scale catastrophe. Plato described Atlantis being destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. For centuries, scholars considered this obviously exaggerated. But combine rapid sea level rise with tsunami events, ongoing seismic activity, and possible impact effects, and destruction within a day becomes not just possible but expected. The civilization doesn't need to sink completely in 24 hours. It only needs to be rendered uninhabitable, its population killed or scattered, its infrastructure destroyed beyond recovery. The geological record shows something catastrophic happened around 9600 BCE. The exact timing Plato specified. The coincidence is remarkable. Or perhaps it's not coincidence at all. The Atlantic floor keeps records. Sediment cores drilled from the ocean bottom reveal layers, each representing a period of deposition, building up over millennia. These cores show something unusual around the time frame we keep encountering. Distinct layers corresponding to massive disturbances between 9600 and 11,000 BCE. The composition of these layers is revealing. Shocked quartz, tiny spherules of melted rock, elevated iridium and platinum levels. These materials suggest extreme events, intense heat, massive energy release, the kind of signatures you find at impact sites. Evidence from the Azores region specifically shows signs of rapid change. Sediment cores contain layers where shallow water organisms suddenly appear at depths, mixed with deep water species. The interpretation: rapid subsidence, land sinking, or being buried so quickly that shallow water creatures were displaced to depths they couldn't normally inhabit. Pillow lava formations, which form when lava cools underwater, appear at depths that suggest they formed in shallow water or on land, then sank to their current positions. The region didn't maintain stable depth. It changed, dramatically and relatively quickly. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is one of Earth's most geologically active zones. The spreading center, where tectonic plates pull apart, creating new oceanic crust through volcanic activity. Studies of this region show periods of intense activity correlating with the end of the Ice Age, not coincidence. As massive ice sheets melted, the removal of their enormous weight caused crustal adjustments worldwide. Post-glacial rebound. Where ice had pressed down, land rose. Where ocean basins filled with meltwater, crust sank under the added weight. The entire planetary crust adjusted, triggering earthquakes and volcanism. The Storegga slides off Norway provide a specific example. Massive submarine landslides during this period, where enormous sections of continental shelf collapsed and slid into the deep. The volumes involved were staggering. The resulting tsunamis reached Scotland, Denmark, possibly further. Wave heights of 80 feet or more. If similar submarine landslides occurred in the Atlantic, any island civilization would have faced devastating consequences. Research shows volcanic activity in Iceland and the Azores increased dramatically at the end of the Ice Age. Cores from the region reveal ash layers from this period, evidence of major eruptions coinciding with rapid deglaciation. Beach sediments appear at unexpected depths on Atlantic seamounts and plateaus. These formations show evidence of wave action, surf erosion, features that form at sea level. They're now hundreds or thousands of feet underwater. Either sea level rose dramatically, or the formations sank, or both. Evidence of mega-tsunamis appears in Atlantic coastal regions. Deposits high above current sea level containing marine materials, coral fragments, ocean sediments, hundreds of feet inland and elevated. Wave events of extraordinary magnitude, carrying ocean materials far beyond normal storm surge reach. The combination of rapidly rising seas, earthquake-triggered tsunamis, submarine landslides, and possible impact-generated waves would create conditions matching ancient descriptions of sudden catastrophic flooding. The geological evidence doesn't prove Atlantis existed, but it proves something violent happened in the Atlantic region during the exact time frame Plato specified. The rocks remember what we forgot. Sediment layers document catastrophe. Volcanic formations show dramatic depth changes. Tsunami deposits mark extraordinary wave events. Whether or not a civilization called Atlantis was destroyed during this period, the mechanisms for such destruction definitely existed and definitely occurred. The geology supports the possibility. The timing aligns. The location shows the scars. What's missing is the archaeology. But archaeology requires looking, and we've barely begun exploring the Atlantic floor for Ice Age settlements. The evidence of catastrophe is there. The question is what that catastrophe destroyed. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey shouldn't exist. Discovered in the 1990 seconds, dated to 9600 BCE, the same date Plato gave for Atlantis' destruction. The site consists of massive carved pillars arranged in circles, sophisticated architecture, astronomical alignments. The people who built it supposedly hadn't discovered agriculture yet. They were hunter-gatherers, according to standard timelines. Hunter-gatherers don't build monuments requiring organization, specialized knowledge, sustained effort from large populations. Except these ones did. The discovery forced reconsideration of what Ice Age humans were capable of. Not primitive savages struggling to survive, but organized societies with advanced planning abilities, hierarchical structures allowing large-scale projects, specialized knowledge of engineering and astronomy. Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated anomaly. Karahan Tepe and other sites in the region show similar sophistication. This was a culture, possibly a civilization, operating at a level that shouldn't have been possible according to what we thought we knew. Other problematic sites exist. Underwater structures off Japan's Yonaguni Island showing features difficult to explain as purely natural. The megalithic temples of Malta, potentially older than conventional dating suggests. Sites worldwide pushing back dates for architectural sophistication, for astronomical knowledge, for organized society. Each discovery chips away at the narrative of linear progress, from primitive to advanced. The Lascaux and Chauvet cave paintings demonstrate artistic sophistication that contradicts the primitive savage characterization. These weren't crude stick figures. They were skilled artwork showing understanding of perspective, movement, anatomy. Astronomical alignments at ancient sites suggest Ice Age peoples understood celestial mechanics, tracked planetary movements, incorporated this knowledge into their constructions. Genetic evidence reveals complex population movements during the late Ice Age. Migrations, admixtures, interactions between groups separated by distance, suggesting more organization and capability than standard models propose. The Neolithic Revolution, the supposedly independent invention of agriculture in multiple locations around 9000 BCE, might not be independent at all. Perhaps knowledge spread from refugees of destroyed civilizations, carrying fragments of what was lost to new regions, where they rebuilt simpler versions of what they remembered. Cultural discontinuity appears in the archaeological record. Advanced techniques emerging suddenly, without clear developmental progression. Knowledge appearing where it shouldn't, in populations that supposedly developed in isolation. Later cultures sometimes showing less sophistication than earlier ones, suggesting knowledge was lost and had to be slowly rediscovered. The standard narrative is linear progress. Primitive Ice Age hunters gradually developing into agricultural societies, slowly advancing towards civilization. But what if the Ice Age wasn't humanity's infancy? What if it was a dark age, a period of recovery after something greater was lost? The survivors of whatever catastrophe destroyed Ice Age coastal civilizations would have been refugees, scattered, struggling to preserve what they could of the old knowledge. Some might have succeeded partially. Others might have lost everything, forced to start over. The variety of outcomes would explain the pattern we see, pockets of surprising sophistication amid generally simpler cultures. Göbekli Tepe was built by organized people with advanced knowledge at the exact moment Atlantis supposedly fell. Coincidence? Or were they rebuilding, trying to preserve what they remembered from before the waters rose and the old world drowned? The Great Pyramid of Giza covers 13 acres. The base is level to within fractions of an inch across that entire area. The sides are lined to true north within 3 arc minutes, a degree of accuracy that shouldn't be achievable without sophisticated instruments. The construction incorporates mathematical constants like pi and phi in ways that suggest deep understanding of geometric principles. This isn't interpretation or mysticism. These are measurements, objective and verifiable. Modern engineers examining the precision expressed genuine puzzlement. Not wonder at alien intervention, but professional confusion about how specific accuracies were achieved. The granite boxes in the Serapeum of Saqqara exemplify this puzzle. Each box weighs up to 100 tons, carved from solid granite, one of the hardest stones in existence. The internal surfaces are flat and smooth to within a few thousandths of an inch. Achieving that precision in granite requires not just effort, but sophisticated understanding of measurement, of geometry, of material properties. The drilling marks found on ancient Egyptian stonework show core rates and techniques that puzzle modern experts. Cores extracted from hard stone at speeds that seem impossible with copper tools and abrasive sand, the supposed technology available. The explanations offered, massive labor forces and unlimited time, address scale but not precision. You can throw unlimited workers at a project and still not achieve tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Precision requires knowledge. The pattern repeats worldwide. Baalbek in Lebanon has trilithon stones weighing over 800 tons each, precisely fitted into a temple platform. How they were quarried, transported, and placed with such accuracy remains unclear. Ollantaytambo in Peru shows precision-cut surfaces on massive stones, complex joinery, fitting irregular shapes together with minimal gaps. Pumapunku in Bolivia displays intricate cut patterns in hard andesite, surfaces flat enough to use as reference planes for modern machinery. These aren't isolated examples from a single culture that might have developed unique techniques. They appear across continents, across supposedly isolated civilizations, suggesting either independent invention of similar advanced methods or transmission of knowledge from a common source. The mainstream explanation favors independent invention, but independent invention of the same sophisticated precision techniques across cultures separated by oceans requires assuming remarkable coincidence. What's perhaps most mysterious isn't that ancient peoples achieved this precision. It's that they achieved it, then apparently lost the ability. Later civilizations in the same regions working with the same materials couldn't replicate what their ancestors had done. Egyptian construction after the Old Kingdom never matched the precision of the pyramids. Knowledge was lost, techniques forgotten, requiring centuries or millennia to slowly rediscover. Precision isn't something you achieve through brute force. You can't accidentally align a massive structure to true north within arc minutes. You can't casually carve granite to thousandths of an inch tolerances. These achievements require theoretical understanding, mathematical knowledge, sophisticated measurement techniques. Either ancient peoples developed this knowledge independently in multiple locations, then somehow all forgot it, or they inherited it from an earlier source. A source that possessed advanced understanding and transmitted it to subsequent cultures, some of whom preserved it better than others, until catastrophe disrupted the transmission and the knowledge began fragmenting and fading. The stones remember the precision, even if we've forgotten how it was achieved. There's an iron pillar in Delhi that stood exposed to weather for 1600 years. Iron rusts. That's fundamental material behavior. Especially in India's humid climate, iron should corrode relatively quickly. This pillar shows virtually no rust. For centuries, this seemed almost magical. Modern metallurgical analysis eventually revealed why. The composition and manufacturing technique create a protective layer that prevents corrosion. The remarkable part isn't just that this protection exists, but that it demonstrates knowledge of metallurgical principles that Europe wouldn't rediscover for over 1,000 years. Ancient Egypt provides more puzzles. Iron beads dated to 3200 BCE, predating the supposed Iron Age by 1500 years. Not meteoritic iron, which ancient peoples occasionally worked, but smelted iron, requiring controlled processes and specific knowledge. The standard timeline says this shouldn't exist. The artifacts disagree with the timeline. Damascus steel became legendary in medieval times for properties that modern metallurgy struggled to replicate until the 20th century. Strength, flexibility, the ability to hold an impossibly sharp edge, distinctive watered patterns in the metal. The manufacturing technique was lost when the civilization that produced it collapsed. This demonstrates something important. Sophisticated metallurgical knowledge can completely disappear. It requires specific facilities, controlled conditions, master craftsmen teaching apprentices. Disrupt that chain, and the knowledge vanishes, sometimes for centuries. The Baghdad battery, controversial but documented, consists of artifacts that some researchers interpret as primitive electrochemical cells. If accurate, this suggests knowledge of basic electrochemistry in ancient Mesopotamia. Even skeptics of the battery interpretation acknowledge the artifacts exist, and their purpose remains unclear. South American cultures produced platinum artifacts. Platinum melts at 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Basic forges don't reach those temperatures. How did cultures supposedly working with simple metallurgy manipulate a metal that requires extreme heat even to soften? The artifacts exist. The explanation remains disputed. Then there's orichalcum. Plato described it as a red gold metal prized by Atlanteans, second only to gold in value. For centuries, scholars assumed he invented it, that no such metal existed. In 2015, a shipwreck off Sicily yielded ingots of an unusual copper-zinc lead alloy. When cleaned, they displayed a distinctive red-gold color. Ancient descriptions of orichalcum match this appearance. The metal Plato described, dismissed as fiction, turns out to be real. Metallurgy isn't just practical craft. It requires theoretical understanding of chemistry, of how different elements combine and behave under heat and stress. This knowledge doesn't emerge casually from trial and error. It requires systematic experimentation, record-keeping, transmission of accumulated understanding across generations. Lose the records, kill the masters, destroy the facilities, and the knowledge disappears. The pattern we see globally suggests sophisticated metallurgical knowledge existed in antiquity, appeared in various cultures at levels that seem anachronistic, then was lost and had to be slowly rediscovered. Iron that doesn't rust, steel with properties we couldn't replicate for centuries, platinum working at temperatures that shouldn't be reachable, metals described in ancient texts that we assumed were fictional until we found them. Knowledge like that doesn't emerge from nowhere. It accumulates over time, requires stable civilizations to develop and transmit, and it can be lost completely when catastrophe strikes. The metallurgical sophistication we find scattered across ancient cultures might be fragments, remnants of more complete knowledge that existed before something went terribly wrong. The Great Pyramid aligns to true north within 3 arc-minutes of a degree. That's not approximate. That's precision requiring accurate instruments and sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Stonehenge tracks solar and lunar cycles with mathematical accuracy. Mayan temples orient to Venus with precision calculated to hours over centuries. These aren't vague alignments you can attribute to chance. These are deliberate astronomical calculations embedded in stone. The Antikythera mechanism shouldn't exist. Discovered in a shipwreck dated to around 100 BCE, it's a complex geared device that calculated astronomical positions, predicted eclipses, tracked planetary movements. The mechanical sophistication, the precise gear ratios, the astronomical knowledge it represents, supposedly wouldn't appear again until medieval European clockwork, over 1,000 years later. What else was lost in that gap? What other devices and knowledge disappeared when libraries burned and civilizations fell? Ancient peoples knew things they supposedly couldn't know. Mayans calculated Venus cycles accurate to within hours over periods of centuries. How? What instruments? What mathematical methods? Hindu texts contain values for Earth's diameter and the distance to the moon that are remarkably accurate. Babylonian astronomers predicted lunar eclipses with precision that required sophisticated mathematical models. Ancient maps show accurate longitude. This shouldn't be possible. Determining longitude requires precise timekeeping, marine chronometers that weren't developed until the 18th century. Yet, Portolan charts and maps like Piri Reis display longitude accuracy that predates the technology supposedly needed to measure it. Either the maps were created with knowledge we assume didn't exist, or they were copied from older sources that had that knowledge. Mathematics, embedded in ancient architecture, suggests theoretical understanding beyond practical necessity. Pi appears in constructions predating any known mathematical derivation of that constant. The golden ratio shows up in Egyptian, Greek, and Mayan buildings. Complex geometric principles applied consistently. Why would supposedly primitive peoples incorporate advanced mathematics into their buildings, unless they possessed sophisticated theoretical knowledge? Evidence suggests ancient understanding of precession, the 26,000-year wobble in Earth's axis. Detecting this requires observations spanning centuries, sophisticated record-keeping across generations, mathematical analysis of accumulated data. Yet references to precessional cycles appear in ancient texts and possibly in ancient monuments. The Mesopotamian sexagesimal system, base 6-0 mathematics, is remarkably suited for astronomical calculations. Why would a supposedly primitive culture develop such an advanced mathematical system unless they needed it for complex calculations? Ancient texts reference astronomical events that scholars initially dismissed as mythology until modern astronomy confirmed them as accurate. Egyptian calendars tracked stellar cycles with precision. Vedic texts contain astronomical positions that can be dated to specific periods. Mayan calendars extend back thousands of years with mathematical precision. The simplest explanation for global astronomical sophistication is parallel development, each culture independently discovering celestial mechanics. But the complexity involved, the similarities in approach, the advanced mathematics required, all suggest an alternative: inheritance. Knowledge developed by an earlier culture, transmitted to successor civilizations, preserved with varying degrees of accuracy. Some cultures maintained more complete records, others retained fragments. But the core knowledge, the astronomical understanding, the mathematical sophistication, might have originated from a common source now lost. A civilization that had already achieved advanced astronomical science and passed elements of it to those who came after. Cocaine and tobacco are New World plants. They don't grow naturally in Africa or Europe, yet both have been found in ancient Egyptian mummies, confirmed through multiple independent tests. The initial reaction was denial, contamination, mislabeling, anything to explain away results that shouldn't exist. Further testing confirmed the findings. Either these plants somehow existed in the Old World and went completely extinct, leaving no other trace, or ancient peoples traded across the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus. Chickens in South America provide similar evidence. Genetic analysis shows they originated from Polynesia, arriving in South America before European contact. Pre-Columbian trans-Pacific voyaging, proven through DNA. If Pacific Islanders regularly navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using sophisticated knowledge of currents, stars, and wave patterns, why assume Atlantic peoples with equally advanced civilizations couldn't navigate a much smaller ocean? Anomalous artifacts appear where they shouldn't. A Roman head sculpture found in Mexico in a pre-Columbian context. A Roman shipwreck discovered off Brazil. Inscriptions in North America that some epigraphers interpret as ancient European scripts, though these remain controversial. Norse presence in North America centuries before Columbus is now accepted fact, proving pre-Columbian Atlantic crossing was possible. If Vikings could do it, why not earlier mariners from more advanced civilizations? Ancient ship construction demonstrates sophistication often overlooked. Phoenician vessels were ocean-going craft capable of extended voyages. Egyptian ships transported massive obelisk stones weighing hundreds of tons, requiring advanced naval architecture and understanding of weight distribution and stability. Evidence of ancient knowledge of currents and seasonal wind patterns suggests systematic navigation techniques, not random coastal hopping. Plato described Atlantis as a naval power that could reach distant lands. If such a civilization existed in the Atlantic region, it would necessarily have possessed advanced maritime technology. Sophisticated shipbuilding, navigation techniques, knowledge of ocean routes, exactly the capabilities that mounting evidence suggests did exist in antiquity, but that mainstream timelines insist couldn't have. Consider what gets lost when maritime civilizations are destroyed. Ships rot or sink. Harbor facilities are the first casualties of rising seas. Navigators die without passing on their knowledge. The entire technological and knowledge base of oceanic voyaging can disappear within a generation if catastrophe strikes coastal populations. Later societies, starting from scratch inland, would have to rediscover everything about shipbuilding and navigation through slow trial and error. This explains a pattern in history. Evidence of ancient seafaring capability, followed by apparent loss, followed by gradual rediscovery. Not linear progress, but cycles of achievement and loss. The technology exists, catastrophe strikes, the knowledge vanishes, later cultures slowly rebuild maritime capabilities they assume no one achieved before them. If Atlantis was a maritime civilization positioned in the Atlantic, it would have possessed exactly what Plato described: naval power, ability to reach distant shores, trade routes spanning an ocean. The technology required isn't impossible or alien. It's the same capability Pacific Islanders demonstrably had, the same capability Vikings later rediscovered. The question isn't whether such maritime sophistication could exist in antiquity. Evidence proves it did. The question is whether an Atlantic civilization possessed it before catastrophic flooding erased every trace of their ships, their ports, and their navigators, forcing later peoples to assume oceanic voyaging was impossible because they'd forgotten it had been done before. Pyramids are stable structures. Stack stones in a pyramid shape and gravity holds them together, making the form practical for building tall monuments without advanced engineering. This explanation satisfies the question of why pyramids appear in multiple cultures. It's logical, it's simple, it's the official answer. And it completely fails to address the actual pattern. Egypt's pyramids demonstrate precision alignment to cardinal directions, astronomical orientations, mathematical sophistication in their proportions. Mesopotamian ziggurats served as temple mountains with specific religious significance and complex internal structures. Mesoamerican pyramids in Mexico and Guatemala incorporate astronomical alignments tracking solar and Venus cycles, built with massive stones fitted with remarkable precision. Sudan contains more pyramids than Egypt, often overlooked in popular consciousness but numerous and sophisticated. China has pyramid structures, some larger than those at Giza, though less well known internationally. Indonesia's Gunung Padang shows what may be pyramid construction, controversial in dating but undeniable in structure. The similarities go beyond shape. Many align precisely to cardinal directions, requiring sophisticated surveying. Many incorporate astronomical observations into their design and orientation. Many contain similar internal chamber designs, with corbelled ceilings and specific architectural features. Many were built using massive stones, cut and fitted with precision that seems excessive for simple religious monuments. The technical parallels are specific. Precisely cut megalithic blocks, similar corbelled ceiling construction techniques, incorporation of water features and drainage systems into the design. Dating controversies surround many of these structures. Geological analysis sometimes suggests dates older than traditional archaeological dating accepts, which would make geographically separated pyramids potentially contemporary with each other. The structures often exist as parts of larger planned complexes, causeways connecting multiple pyramids, smaller satellite pyramids arranged in specific patterns, associated temples and buildings, suggesting sophisticated urban planning. These aren't isolated monuments, they're elements of comprehensive architectural visions. Symbolic parallels repeat across cultures. Pyramids associate with death rituals and afterlife beliefs. They connect to solar worship and astronomical observations. They represent sacred mountains or cosmic order in mythological systems. The architectural form carries similar meanings in cultures supposedly isolated from each other. Here's the puzzle that the stable structure explanation doesn't address. Why would diverse cultures, separated by impassable oceans, independently decide to expend enormous resources building mountains of stone, using similar techniques, incorporating similar astronomical alignments, associating them with similar symbolic meanings, and organizing them into similar complex layouts? Once might be chance, twice could be coincidence, but the pattern appears on every continent where ancient civilizations developed. Independent invention strains credibility when the parallels are this specific. The alternative is contact or shared inheritance. Either ancient peoples traveled and traded more extensively than mainstream history acknowledges, spreading architectural knowledge across oceans, or multiple cultures inherited similar building traditions from an earlier common source. Plato described Atlantis as having pyramid-like structures, as serving as a cultural center with influence extending to surrounding regions. If a single advanced civilization existed in a central Atlantic location, positioned between Old and New World, it could have influenced multiple regions before its destruction. Refugees carrying architectural knowledge, spreading to different shores, teaching what they remembered to the peoples they encountered. The variations we see might reflect different interpretations and adaptations of a common original tradition, fragmented and transformed as survivors integrated into various host cultures. The pyramid pattern worldwide might not be coincidence or independent invention. It might be echo, memory in stone, cultures around the world building similar structures because they all learned from the same teachers who came from across the waters before the floods came and the old world drowned. Every ancient culture has serpent legends. Egypt had the Uraeus cobra, representing royal power, and Apep, the chaos serpent of the underworld. Mesopotamia described Tiamat, the primordial serpent of the deep waters. Greek mythology featured Ladon guarding golden apples, and Typhon the serpent monster. Norse tradition told of Jörmungandr, the world serpent surrounding the earth. Hindu texts speak of Nagas, serpent beings of wisdom, and Vritra, the drought demon serpent. Chinese dragons, benevolent and wise. Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, the feathered serpents who brought knowledge. Japanese dragons guarding treasures and controlling waters. The list continues across every continent. The psychological explanation is obvious. Serpents exist everywhere humans live. They're dangerous, fascinating, mysterious. Of course, they become prominent in mythology and symbolism. This explains prevalence, but not specificity. Look at the specific attributes these serpent myths share. Association with water, particularly primordial waters or floods. Guardianship of wisdom, knowledge, or treasure. representation of both cosmic order and chaos, beneficial and dangerous simultaneously, connection to creation, myths, and origin stories. And repeatedly, connection to ancient times, to pre-flood ages, to lost knowledge from before the current world. Multiple traditions describe serpent beings as pre-flood entities who possessed ancient wisdom and taught early humanity. The Sumerian traditions speak of Apkallu, 7 sages emerging from the sea before the flood to teach civilization. They're depicted with serpent-like or fish features, beings from the waters bringing knowledge. The Oannes myth from Mesopotamia describes similar water-dwelling teachers. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, brought knowledge and civilization to Mesoamerica. Various traditions describe antediluvian sages associated with serpent imagery. Plato described Atlantis as ruled by descendants of Poseidon, god of the sea, with serpent and sea monster imagery featuring in the mythology. If Atlantis was a maritime civilization destroyed by floods, how might survivors be remembered? As teachers from across the waters, possessors of lost ancient knowledge associated with the sea and its creatures. The serpent, living in water and on land, mysterious and powerful, becomes the symbol through which these memories are preserved. Serpent symbolism appears in architecture worldwide. Feathered serpent carvings in both Egyptian and Mesoamerican temples. Dragon motifs in Asian and European structures. The parallels aren't vague, they're specific enough to be troubling. European and Asian dragon legends describe creatures guarding ancient treasures or knowledge. Perhaps the treasure is metaphorical, representing forgotten wisdom from lost civilizations. If refugees from a destroyed maritime civilization spread to multiple shores, how would later generations remember them? The specifics would fade and transform through oral tradition. But the core memory might persist. Wise teachers who came from the waters, possessors of ancient knowledge, bringing civilization after a great catastrophe. The serpent, creature of water and mystery, becomes the symbol encoding this memory. The universal serpent might not be parallel invention. It might be shared memory, distorted through millennia of retelling but preserving a truth, that teachers came from across the waters, that they possessed wisdom from a lost time, that they arrived after floods destroyed something that came before. Every continent remembers this story, because every continent received refugees from the same catastrophe, survivors teaching what they could, remembered eventually as serpent beings from the primordial waters, carrying lost knowledge from the age before the flood. Mainstream linguistics is clear and confident. Old World and New World languages developed completely independently, with no contact, no shared ancestry, beyond the deepest prehistoric human origins. This certainty rests on solid methodology and extensive analysis. It's also worth noting that some researchers have found patterns they consider troubling, similarities that seem to exceed what coincidence should produce. The claims are controversial and largely rejected by academic linguistics. Maya words that phonetically resemble ancient Mediterranean terms. Polynesian and South American linguistic parallels beyond what Polynesian chicken DNA can explain. Claimed similarities between ancient Sumerian and Mesoamerican languages. Most linguists attribute these to coincidence, confirmation bias, or overeager pattern recognition. Languages have limited phonetic possibilities, and superficial similarities will occur randomly. Fair point. The question is whether some similarities exceed what random chance predicts. Similar terms for concepts like kingship, temple, deity, appear in languages that supposedly never contacted each other. Again, the mainstream explanation is that human societies independently develop similar social structures, and thus similar vocabulary for describing those structures. Possible. But when the phonetic similarities accompany conceptual similarities, the coincidence multiplies. The Atlas concept itself is intriguing. Greek tradition has the Titan Atlas, the Atlas Mountains. Some researchers claim similar names appear in Mesoamerican mythology, like Aztlan, the Aztec ancestral homeland. Mainstream scholarship dismisses this as superficial phonetic coincidence. Perhaps. But the pattern of claimed similarities keeps appearing, suggesting either many researchers are seeing patterns that aren't there, or there's something worth investigating that gets dismissed too readily. We know ancient language diffusion over vast areas occurred. Indo-European languages prove it. From India to Ireland, languages descend from a common source, proving that ancient peoples spread across enormous distances carrying linguistic heritage. If it happened once, could it have happened earlier? in ways that linguistic deep time has now obscured. Writing system parallels between ancient scripts separated by oceans are claimed by some researchers, dismissed by most scholars as coincidence or limited ways to represent phonetic concepts visually. The evaluation requires expertise most people lack, making independent assessment difficult. We're left trusting either the mainstream consensus or the maverick researchers, neither of which is entirely satisfying. Linguistic deep time presents a fundamental challenge. Languages change radically over millennia. Documented language families rarely trace back more than 6,000 or 7,000 years before connections dissolve into uncertainty. If an Atlantean civilization influenced both Old and New World languages 12,000 years ago, would any recognizable connection remain today? Probably not. The linguistic fingerprints would be ghosts, so faint and fragmented that distinguishing them from coincidence becomes nearly impossible. This is why linguistic evidence for Atlantis remains the weakest line of inquiry. The time depth is too great, the changes too extensive, the possibilities for false pattern recognition too numerous. Honest assessment requires acknowledging that claimed linguistic connections might be entirely illusory, products of researchers finding what they want to find. Yet the claims persist. Multiple researchers, working independently, keep identifying patterns they consider significant. Either they're all suffering from the same confirmation bias, or there's something beneath the noise that deserves more rigorous investigation than dismissive rejection. Linguistic evidence won't prove Atlantis, but it might provide hints, faint echoes of ancient connections that time has almost completely erased. The ghosts of words from a language spoken when the world was different, preserved in fragments so small we can barely distinguish them from shadows. Tamil tradition speaks of Kumari Kandam, an ancient sunken landmass off India's southern coast. Not vague mythology, but specific literary tradition describing sophisticated culture, multiple cities, advanced learning, all lost when the ocean claimed the land. Geological evidence supports the basic claim. The Indian shelf was exposed during the Ice Age, flooded as seas rose. The flooding happened. The question is, what was lost in it? Japanese legends describe Ryugu-jo, the underwater dragon palace. Pacific Islander traditions across Polynesia preserve memories of Hiva or Hawaii, ancestral homelands that sank beneath the waves. These aren't generic flood myths, they're specific geographical traditions about known regions now submerged. Aztec tradition describes Aztlan, an ancestral homeland from which their people migrated. The accounts describe an island surrounded by water. Where this island was, if it existed, remains debated. Mu and Lemuria appear frequently in alternative literature, but are largely 19th century inventions rather than authentic ancient traditions. They muddy the waters, making serious investigation of genuine traditions more difficult. Celtic legends tell of Lyonesse, a land between Cornwall and the Scilly Isles, claimed by the sea. The Welsh remember Cyntra Gwaelod, a lowland kingdom protected by seawalls that failed. These might preserve memories of actual European coastal flooding as seas rose following the Ice Age. The English Channel and Irish Sea were dry land once. When they flooded, settlements were lost. Those losses might be remembered in legend. The Black Sea flood hypothesis has geological support. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake until catastrophic inundation from the Mediterranean around 5600 BCE. That event would have displaced populations, destroyed settlements, created exactly the kind of traumatic memory that persists in oral tradition. This could be the source of flood traditions throughout the region, a real catastrophe remembered mythologically. Multiple possibilities exist. These traditions might represent different catastrophes affecting different regions during the post-Ice Age flooding period. Regional events, each significant to the culture that experienced it. Or they might represent a single global catastrophe remembered differently by various cultures. The same period of rapid sea level rise and geological instability experienced worldwide. Or they might represent memories of one major civilization whose destruction resonated globally, with different cultures preserving different details based on their specific experience of the catastrophe. Oral traditions preserve core elements while details shift. This explains why we might have multiple versions of similar stories. Plato's account might preserve the most detailed version because it passed through Egyptian written records rather than pure oral tradition. Written transmission preserves details that oral transmission transforms. The existence of multiple independent traditions of lost lands suggests catastrophic flooding, destroying advanced cultures wasn't isolated to one location. It affected multiple regions during the same general period. Whether Atlantis was one example of a broader phenomenon or the central event from which all other traditions derive remains unclear. But the pattern is undeniable. Cultures worldwide remember lands that were lost, civilizations that drowned, knowledge that was forgotten when the waters rose. They remember because something real happened, even if the details have become mythology. Skepticism is a virtue in science. Many theories about Atlantis have been genuinely ridiculous, mixing ancient aliens with mystical crystal powers and lost psychic civilizations. Scholarly caution is not just justified but necessary. The question is, when healthy skepticism hardens into something else, something that looks less like careful evaluation and more like institutional defense of established narratives regardless of evidence. Robert Schoch is a geologist, credentialed and respected in his field. When he examined the Sphinx and identified water erosion patterns suggesting construction far earlier than accepted chronology, he didn't speculate wildly. He presented geological evidence using standard methodology. The response from Egyptology wasn't engagement with his evidence, but fierce criticism focused on the fact that he dared challenge established dating. His credentials didn't protect him. The evidence didn't matter as much as the fact that accepting it would require rewriting timelines. When Göbekli Tepe's age and sophistication were first proposed, many scholars dismissed the claims as impossible. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers couldn't build sophisticated monuments, requiring organization and specialized knowledge. The timeline didn't allow it. Only overwhelming, undeniable evidence forced acceptance. But even now, the implications haven't been fully absorbed. The discovery should have prompted systematic reconsideration of what Ice Age peoples were capable of. Instead, it's treated as an interesting anomaly, while the larger narrative remains unchanged. Academic specialization creates blind spots. Archaeologists often lack expertise to evaluate geological evidence. Geologists aren't trained in archaeological interpretation. When interdisciplinary theories emerge requiring both fields to contribute, they're frequently rejected by both. Neither discipline wants to venture outside its expertise, and neither trusts the other's evaluation of evidence outside their specialty. The result is that interdisciplinary questions, which Atlantis certainly is, get dismissed not because evidence is weak, but because no single field feels qualified or willing to address them comprehensively. Paradigm protection is real. Established models get defended long after evidence begins contradicting them because too many careers, textbooks, institutional reputations are invested in current understanding. Changing fundamental narratives doesn't just require admitting previous certainty was premature. It requires scholars to acknowledge their life's work might be built on incomplete or incorrect assumptions. That's a hard thing to accept, and human nature resists it even when evidence accumulates. Funding follows consensus. Research into controversial topics attracts little institutional support. Grants flow toward projects that confirm existing models, that fill in details of accepted narratives. Proposals to investigate Atlantis or similar alternative theories face skepticism in peer review, not because the methodology is flawed, but because the questions themselves are considered illegitimate. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Lack of published research is cited as evidence that alternative ideas have no merit, but the lack of publication stems from institutional unwillingness to fund or publish such research. Science claims to follow evidence wherever it leads. In theory, that's true. In practice, human institutions are about protecting established order, maintaining consensus, avoiding disruption. Sometimes these purposes conflict, and when they do, evidence that threatens accepted narratives often gets ignored rather than investigated. Not through conspiracy, but through the subtle, systemic bias of institutions protecting themselves from uncomfortable truths. The basic problem is simple. If advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age, they would have concentrated on coastlines. Humans settle on coasts. We always have. Access to marine resources, moderate climate, trade routes, all make coastal settlement attractive. Ice Age coastlines are now underwater, hundreds of feet down, covered by millennia of sediment. If we want to understand Ice Age civilization, we need to look underwater. We haven't. The numbers are stark. Approximately 8 million square kilometers of continental shelf that was exposed during the Ice Age is now submerged. That's an area larger than Australia. Systematic archaeological survey of these areas has been minimal. Perhaps 1% has been examined with any rigor. The rest remains unexplored, written off as too difficult, too expensive, not worth the effort. Underwater archaeology is challenging. It requires expensive equipment, specialized training, ships that can stay on station for extended periods, deep diving technology for anything beyond shallow depths, remote-operated vehicles for truly deep sites. The work proceeds slowly, produces results gradually, costs substantially more than terrestrial archaeology. Funding priorities reflect these realities. Underwater excavation receives a tiny fraction of total archaeological funding, and most of that goes toward historical shipwrecks or known ancient ports, not exploratory survey of deep continental shelves. The bias this creates is massive. Archaeology has enormous samples of terrestrial sites from the past 10,000 years. Almost no sample of coastal sites from 12 to 20,000 years ago. The picture we have of Ice Age civilization is based almost entirely on inland sites that happen to stay dry. Everything built on coasts, where most advanced settlements would logically be, is now invisible to us unless we specifically look underwater. The few underwater discoveries that have been made are revealing. Dwarka off India's coast, Pavlopetri off Greece, Atlat Yam off Israel. Black Sea settlements from when it was a freshwater lake before catastrophic flooding, controversial formations off Japan and the Bahamas. Most of these were found accidentally, not through systematic search. The question is, what else exists that we haven't stumbled upon because we're not looking deliberately? Deep water sites present extraordinary challenges. The Azores Plateau and similar Atlantic formations lie hundreds to thousands of feet down. Investigating them requires robotic submarines, advanced sonar systems, technology that exists and has been used extensively for oil exploration, but rarely for archaeology. When unusual underwater formations are discovered, investigation remains limited. The Bimini Road formations, declared natural after limited study. Critics note the investigation seemed motivated more by desire to close the case than thorough inquiry. Yonaguni structures off Japan remain controversial. Geologists see features suggesting carving and construction. Archaeologists insist it's natural. The debate continues because comprehensive investigation hasn't occurred. Similar stories repeat at multiple sites. Formations that deserve serious study receive minimal attention or are declared natural based on preliminary analysis. Every decade we delay systematic underwater survey is a decade closer to complete burial under sediment or further degradation of structures that might exist. Technology exists now to properly survey Atlantic underwater sites. Advanced sonar, robotic submersibles, imaging systems capable of detecting artificial structures under sediment. The technology exists. Funding and institutional will don't. Here's the question that deserves an answer. If mainstream archaeology is confident Atlantis doesn't exist, why resist properly surveying the exact locations where evidence would most likely appear if it did exist? The reluctance to look suggests less confidence than the public declarations imply. You don't avoid investigation if you're certain you won't find anything. You avoid investigation when you're worried you might. Göbekli Tepe faced resistance not just to its discovery, but to what it implied. When Klaus Schmidt first proposed the site's age and sophistication, many scholars dismissed his dating as impossible. The evidence eventually became undeniable, forcing acceptance. But acceptance of Göbekli Tepe hasn't led to acceptance of its implications. It remains treated as an interesting anomaly rather than a data point, requiring reconsideration of the entire narrative about Ice Age human capabilities. This pattern repeats. Evidence that challenges established chronology faces extraordinary scrutiny, while evidence supporting current models receives routine acceptance. The bias is systematic, not malicious, but its effect is to prevent paradigm-shifting discoveries from shifting paradigms, even when they should. Dating controversies surround multiple sites. The Sphinx water erosion patterns suggesting much earlier construction than accepted dates. Geological evidence is clear. Those erosion patterns require sustained rainfall that hasn't occurred in Egypt for thousands of years before the accepted construction date. Yet archaeologists dismiss geological dating in favor of historical chronology. The Bosnian pyramid controversy pits geological analysis, suggesting very ancient construction, against archaeological insistence they're natural hills. Gunung Padang in Indonesia shows similar conflict between different scientific disciplines, producing radically different age estimates. The problem is methodological. Carbon dating only works on organic materials and can be contaminated. Geological dating uses different principles that archaeologists often dismiss when results contradict expectations. Neither method is perfect, but when they conflict, the tendency is to favor whichever supports existing chronology. Anomalous artifacts create similar problems. The Main Penny, a Viking coin found in a Native American site. The Kensington runestone suggesting pre-Columbian Norse presence deep in North America. Various objects appearing in wrong time periods or wrong locations. The default explanation is hoax or contamination rather than investigation of whether they might be genuine. If you expect no contact between ancient civilizations, you'll interpret ambiguous evidence as coincidence or fraud rather than contact. Underwater sites remain controversial precisely because they're ambiguous. Yonaguni structures off Japan, where geologists see construction features while archaeologists see natural formations. Bimini blocks in the Bahamas, similarly disputed. Mediterranean underwater discoveries, where only the most obviously artificial features are accepted, while ambiguous evidence is ignored. Conservative interpretation is scientifically appropriate, but it becomes problematic when it systematically favors natural or recent explanations over artificial or ancient ones without proportionate investigation. Paradigm paralysis affects how evidence is evaluated. Evidence is filtered through expectations about what's possible. Evidence suggesting the impossible is more likely to be dismissed than to cause reconsideration of what's possible. This isn't conscious conspiracy. It's cognitive bias operating at institutional scale. When discoveries don't fit the timeline, we question the discoveries rather than the timeline. We call this skepticism, and it is. But skepticism that only cuts one way isn't science. It's protection. Protection of comfortable narratives, established reputations, institutional consensus. The question worth asking is whether we're protecting truth or protecting ourselves from having to admit that what we were certain about was wrong. The word conspiracy carries baggage. It signals paranoia, irrational thinking, rejection of reality in favor of fantasy. This association is unfortunate because documented cases of institutional suppression of inconvenient information do exist. Not every claim of conspiracy is delusional. The question is distinguishing real institutional resistance from imagined persecution. Most academic resistance to Atlantis research probably isn't coordinated conspiracy. No smoke-filled rooms where scholars meet to suppress evidence. What exists instead is emergent institutional behavior, unconscious groupthink, and career incentives that produce the same result without requiring coordination. Questioning fundamental narratives brings career costs. Supporting established consensus brings rewards. You don't need conspiracy when the incentive structure naturally produces conformity. Specific cases of restricted information exist. Archaeological sites closed to independent researchers. Artifacts restricted to specific institutional access. Research results taking years or decades to be published, if published at all. These might be explained by bureaucratic caution rather than sinister motives. But the effect is the same: slowing or preventing inquiry that might challenge accepted narratives. Nationalism affects archaeology. Countries sometimes restrict research that might challenge national narratives or pride. Religious institutions have influenced archaeological interpretation at sites with religious significance. These aren't paranoid claims. They're documented patterns of how non-scientific considerations affect scientific inquiry. The Library of Alexandria question is relevant. What knowledge was lost when ancient libraries were destroyed? Would we even know if records of civilizations like Atlantis were among the lost materials? The absence of ancient evidence for Atlantis might result partly from destruction of the very sources that would have confirmed or denied it. We're drawing conclusions based on fragmentary records, assuming that what survived is representative of what existed. Modern scientific history provides cautionary examples. Plate tectonic theory faced decades of resistance despite mounting evidence. The meteorite extinction theory for dinosaurs was dismissed for years before acceptance. Continental drift, heliocentrism, germ theory all faced institutional resistance before eventual acceptance. If mainstream science was wrong about those fundamental issues, it could be wrong about ancient history too. The point isn't to embrace paranoid conspiracy thinking. Most scholars are honest people trying to understand the past based on available evidence. But institutions do protect established narratives, often unconsciously. Career incentives discourage paradigm-challenging research. Funding flows toward confirming existing models. Publication bias favors consensus-supporting papers. These aren't conspiracies. They're systemic features of how academic institutions operate. The absence of conclusive proof for Atlantis might result partly from these systemic factors rather than from Atlantis's non-existence. Questions that threaten accepted stories don't get asked. Evidence that doesn't fit expectations doesn't get investigated. Not through conspiracy, but through the accumulated effect of thousands of small institutional decisions, each individually reasonable, collectively preventing inquiry into uncomfortable possibilities. The effect is the same regardless of intent. Questions go unasked, evidence goes unexplored, and we remain certain about conclusions based on incomplete investigation. Satellites see things humans miss, not in mystical ways but through simple physics. Different wavelengths of light and radar penetrate vegetation, sand, even shallow water, revealing what's hidden from ground level. Synthetic aperture radar doesn't care about jungle canopy or desert sand. It sees through them, detecting subtle variations in surface elevation, geometric patterns, structures that traditional archaeology walking on foot would never notice. The discoveries have been remarkable. Vast ancient irrigation systems in the Middle East that were completely unknown until satellite imagery revealed them. Entire Mayan cities hidden under jungle canopy, invisible from ground level, obvious from space. Ancient roads crossing landscapes, connecting settlements that archaeology hadn't realized were connected. Each discovery demonstrates the same principle. We've been looking at the Earth's surface for millennia, but we've been missing enormous amounts of information because we couldn't see properly. Angkor Wat in Cambodia was thought to be a temple complex, impressive but limited in scale. LiDAR scanning revealed that the temples were just the ceremonial heart of a vast urban landscape, a city extending for miles in every direction, completely hidden by jungle growth. Understanding of ancient Khmer civilization's scale was revolutionized not by excavation but by seeing what was already there, through technology that could penetrate the vegetation. Ground-penetrating radar finds buried structures without digging. Magnetometry detects differences in soil composition that indicate human activity. Entire Roman cities have been mapped without excavating a single trench. Bronze Age monuments invisible from surface have been revealed in complete detail. The technology exists, proven, effective. These same technologies could be applied to underwater Atlantic sites. Satellite bathymetry maps underwater topography in extraordinary detail, potentially revealing anomalous formations on submerged plateaus. Multispectral imaging sometimes detects structures under shallow water. Advanced sonar creates three-dimensional maps of the seafloor with resolution sufficient to identify artificial structures if they exist. The technology exists. It's used routinely for oil exploration, for underwater cable laying, for military purposes. It could be used for archaeology. It hasn't been. Not systematically. Cost is cited as one reason, but cost hasn't prevented deployment for commercial purposes. The real barrier is lack of institutional interest. The question is considered settled. Atlantis doesn't exist, therefore looking for it would be waste of resources. This reasoning is circular. We haven't looked, therefore there's nothing to find, therefore we shouldn't look. Oil and gas companies have created detailed maps of underwater geology, comprehensive data sets covering enormous areas of seafloor. Occasionally, these reveal unexpected features, unusual formations that might be interesting archaeologically. The data remains proprietary, unexplored for archaeological purposes, locked away in corporate databases. The Richat structure in Mauritania, studied from satellite, shows concentric rings eerily similar to Plato's description of Atlantis's capital. Most geologists consider it natural, an eroded geological dome. Perhaps they're right. But perhaps formations like this deserve more investigation than immediate dismissal based on expectations about what should be natural versus artificial. Technology exists to answer the Atlantis question definitively through systematic remote sensing. Satellite survey of Atlantic underwater plateaus could reveal anomalies worth investigating. Advanced sonar could map formations in detail sufficient to distinguish natural from artificial. Ground truthing with submersibles could verify or disprove findings. The technological capability exists today. What's missing is institutional will. We could look properly. We're choosing not to. Ice preserves evidence. Annual layers accumulating over millennia, each layer capturing a snapshot of atmospheric conditions when that snow fell. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica provide year-by-year records extending back hundreds of thousands of years. They're not interpretation or speculation. They're data, objective measurements of what Earth's atmosphere contained during specific time periods. The Younger Dryas period appears clearly in ice cores. Around 10,900 BCE, the cores show massive climate instability. Evidence of widespread burning appears as carbon particles in the ice. Unusual atmospheric composition suggesting extraordinary events. Then, around 9,600 BCE, abrupt warming and the end of the Ice Age. That second date is Plato's dating for Atlantis' destruction. The correspondence is exact. Platinum appears in sediment layers worldwide dated to the Younger Dryas onset, concentrated at levels suggesting extraterrestrial source. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust, but common in certain types of asteroids and comets. The distribution pattern, global and simultaneous, suggests cosmic impacts. The black matte layer found across North America and other regions contains nanodiamonds, tiny diamonds that form under extreme pressure and temperature. Carbon spherules, indicating intense heating, all dated to the same period. The cosmic impact hypothesis faced initial dismissal from mainstream science. Too catastrophic, too sudden, too convenient for explaining extinctions and climate shifts that were supposed to be gradual. But evidence accumulated. Multiple independent research teams found the same signatures in the same time layers. Eventually, resistance broke down. The impacts happened. The question now is only their scale and specific effects. What would cosmic impacts mean for existing civilizations? Tsunamis from ocean impacts potentially hundreds of feet high, traveling thousands of miles, devastating every coastline they reached. Heated ejecta raining down, triggering wildfires across continents. Rapid climate shifts as atmospheric composition changed. Destabilization of ice sheets, accelerating the melting process, contributing to catastrophic flooding. Any advanced civilization, particularly coastal and maritime, would face annihilation. The timing matches perfectly. The Younger Dryas began with catastrophe around 10,900 BCE. It ended with rapid warming and massive flooding around 9,600 BCE. Plato said, Atlantis was destroyed in 9,600 BCE. His dating, considered the most absurd element of his account for centuries, aligns precisely with established climate catastrophe visible in ice cores. Ice cores reveal more. Volcanic activity spiked dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, dust levels indicating massive environmental disruption. Rapid oscillations between cold and warm periods that would have challenged any civilization attempting stability. The planet experienced apocalypse during the exact time frame Plato specified. You don't need to find Atlantis' ruins to know something catastrophic happened when Plato said it did. The ice cores prove it. Whatever else is uncertain about Atlantis, the timing of global catastrophe isn't. The planet remembers what we forgot. The evidence is frozen in ice, waiting for anyone willing to read it. Genetic analysis has revolutionized understanding of ancient populations. DNA extracted from old bones tells stories that artifacts and ruins cannot. Who was related to whom? Which populations mixed? Where people migrated? When distinct groups came into contact, the genetic record preserves information that traditional archaeology misses entirely. Surprising discoveries keep emerging, populations appearing in locations before they should, according to archaeological models. Ancient migrations that weren't suspected from material culture. Genetic mixing between groups, thought to be isolated. Each discovery demonstrates that human movement and interaction in prehistory was more complex than simplified narratives suggested. Ghost populations appear in genetic data. Groups that contributed DNA to modern or ancient populations but left no other archaeological trace. They existed, they interbred with other groups, then they disappeared from the record except for their genetic signature. The Denisovans exemplify this phenomenon. An entire human subspecies identified initially from a finger bone and a tooth. Later found to have contributed significantly to some modern populations. No archaeological culture can be attributed to them. No cities, no distinctive artifacts. Nothing, except genetic evidence proving they existed, spread widely, and influenced human evolution. This proves something crucial. Major populations can exist and disappear, leaving almost no material trace while still affecting the genetic record. If Atlantis existed and was destroyed, if refugees survived and integrated into other populations, genetic traces would remain even if all physical evidence was lost. The question is whether population genetics shows unexpected patterns around the end of the Ice Age. Admixture events, indicating refugee populations integrating into established groups. Genetic diversity appearing suddenly in regions where it hadn't existed. Population movements during the early Holocene period that might represent displaced peoples from catastrophically destroyed civilizations. Challenges exist. Genetic signals from 12,000 years ago are difficult to detect. Subsequent migrations and mixing obscure earlier patterns. We lack ancient DNA from many crucial regions, particularly coastal areas now underwater where Ice Age populations would have concentrated. The sampling problem again. We're drawing conclusions based on whatever DNA happens to survive in locations that stayed dry. Recent findings show unexpected population movements in the period immediately following the Ice Age. Mitochondrial DNA evidence suggesting more complex population structures than previous models proposed. Genetic diversity patterns that don't match expectations based on archaeological cultures. These might be noise, artifacts of incomplete sampling, or they might be signals, faint traces of populations moving in response to catastrophe. The rapid spread of agricultural knowledge around 9000 BCE remains puzzling. The somewhat sudden appearance of early civilizations around 7000 BCE. Traditional explanation is independent invention, separate populations independently developing similar innovations. But the pattern could also fit displaced peoples from destroyed cultures, bringing knowledge to new regions, teaching what they remembered to populations they encountered. Genetic analysis is still young. As more ancient DNA is recovered, particularly from coastal regions and previously unstudied populations, patterns might emerge. Evidence of population movements consistent with catastrophic destruction of coastal civilizations. Admixture events indicating refugee integration. Genetic diversity suggesting more complex interactions than current models propose. If Atlantis existed, if it was destroyed, if refugees survived, their story might be written in genes more clearly than in ruins. DNA doesn't lie. It just needs to be read correctly, and we're still learning how to read it. Plato's description of Atlantis sinking in a day and night seemed absurd for centuries. Land doesn't disappear that quickly. Islands don't just sink. The very idea violated everything science understood about geological processes, which were thought to be gradual, operating over immense timescales. Then came plate tectonics. Accepted only in the 1,960 seconds, plate tectonic theory revealed Earth's crust as dynamic, constantly moving, capable of dramatic changes not just over geological eras, but within human timescales. Land can sink. Islands can disappear. It happens through understood mechanisms, regularly, repeatedly. Liquefaction during intense earthquakes causes sediments to lose integrity. Ground that was solid becomes fluid, structures sink, land subsides. The collapse of magma chambers after massive volcanic eruptions creates calderas, enormous depressions where land drops hundreds of feet or more. Santorini's caldera formed this way during the Minoan eruption. Land that existed is now deep underwater, collapsed into the evacuated space beneath. Isostatic adjustment, the crust's response to changing weight distribution, causes substantial vertical movement. As ice sheets melted at the end of the Ice Age, regions previously pressed down by ice weight rose. Other regions, particularly ocean basins filling with meltwater, sank under the added weight. The entire crust adjusted, triggering earthquakes and volcanic activity worldwide. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is one of Earth's most geologically active zones. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, dramatic land changes occur regularly even today. An island or plateau in this region could be destroyed through multiple mechanisms. Massive volcanic eruption evacuating the magma chamber, followed by caldera collapse. Sustained earthquake sequence, causing liquefaction and subsidence. Mega tsunami generated by submarine landslide or impact, removing population and structures, even if land remained partially above water. Could this happen within Plato's timeframe of a day and night? Complete submergence might require longer, but the destruction of civilization through earthquake, eruption, and tsunami could absolutely occur within 24 hours. The Storegga submarine landslide off Norway generated tsunamis reaching 80 feet high that devastated coastlines thousands of miles away. Similar events in the Atlantic would be catastrophic for any island civilization. The end of the Ice Age combined all these mechanisms. Rapid sea level rise, volcanic activity increasing as crustal stresses shifted, earthquakes triggered by isostatic adjustment, possible cosmic impacts contributing additional shocks. Perfect conditions for civilizational destruction and land loss. Modern geology doesn't make Atlantis' destruction implausible. It makes it entirely possible through well-understood processes. Land can collapse in hours, tsunamis can reach across oceans, volcanic calderas can swallow islands. These aren't theoretical. They're observed, documented, routine geological events. Plato's impossible destruction is actually mundane. The mechanisms he described exist. They operate in the region he specified. The timing he gave corresponds to a period of maximum geological instability. The geology supports the story. Whether the story is true depends on finding evidence, but the mechanisms for its truth definitely existed. Step back and look at what converges. Plato's account with specific geographical and chronological claims. Global flood myths describing advanced civilizations destroyed by water. The end of the Ice Age creating catastrophic flooding exactly when Plato specified. Geological evidence of massive events during that time frame. Unexplained sophistication in cultures emerging immediately after the catastrophe. A massive blind spot in archaeology because we haven't investigated where Ice Age coastal civilizations would actually be. Underwater. These aren't disconnected curiosities. They form a coherent picture when examined together. The timeline convergence is remarkable. Plato dated Atlantis' destruction to around 9,600 BCE. That date corresponds to meltwater pulses and rapid sea level rise. The Younger Dryas climate shift. Evidence of cosmic impacts. The appearance of sites like Göbekli Tepe immediately afterward, sophisticated monuments built by people who supposedly had no precedent for such construction, as if survivors were rebuilding, preserving what they remembered from before. The geographical convergence is equally striking. Plato placed Atlantis in the Atlantic beyond Gibraltar. Flood myths worldwide mention destroyed civilizations, often associated with oceanic catastrophe. Massive areas of Atlantic continental shelf were exposed during the Ice Age, then submerged. The mid-Atlantic ridge provides exactly the geological instability needed for catastrophic destruction. Geography, geology, and ancient memory all point to the same region. Cultural convergence appears in pyramid building traditions worldwide, shared flood myths with specific parallels, similar astronomical knowledge across separated cultures, technological capabilities appearing without clear developmental progression. Each element alone might be dismissed. Together, they suggest pattern rather than coincidence. Pattern recognition requires distinguishing genuine connections from random chance. Fair criticism. But consider what dismissing all these convergences requires. That Plato accidentally got geography and timing right while inventing fiction. That multiple civilizations independently developed identical architectural traditions, astronomical knowledge, and technological capabilities without contact. That global flood myths describing advanced destroyed civilizations are all coincidental independent invention. That the lack of evidence results from absence rather than from our failure to look underwater where evidence would be. Which explanation requires fewer unlikely assumptions? One advanced maritime civilization existed, where Plato said, influenced surrounding regions through trade and contact, was destroyed by catastrophes we know occurred during that period. And its refugees spread knowledge to multiple regions, or dozens of separate coincidences aligned to create false appearance of this pattern. This isn't proof. Proof would require finding ruins, artifacts, unambiguous evidence. But it's synthesis, showing how independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion. Geography points to the Atlantic. Geology confirms catastrophic events at the right time. Ancient memory preserves the story in multiple cultures. Technological parallels suggest common source. Archaeological blind spots explain the absence of definitive evidence. The most likely scenario: an advanced maritime civilization existed in the Atlantic region during the late Ice Age. It influenced both Old and New World cultures through oceanic trade. It was catastrophically destroyed by cosmic impacts, volcanism, earthquakes, and rapid sea level rise that marked the end of the Ice Age. Its refugees spread to multiple coastlines, bringing fragments of advanced knowledge that influenced emerging post-catastrophe cultures. The civilization's physical remains lie underwater, unexplored, waiting. At what point does pattern become signal, when independent evidence keeps pointing the same direction? That point may have already arrived. This is speculation, informed by evidence but still speculation. A reconstruction based on what converges rather than definitive proof. Take it as plausible scenario, not certain fact. Atlantis was likely located on what is now the Azores Plateau or similar Atlantic formation. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower, this would have been substantial landmass, possibly a large island or archipelago. A maritime culture developed there, taking advantage of the positioning. The location makes sense for several reasons. Positioned roughly equidistant between Old World and New World, providing stepping-stone access to both continental regions. Protected by ocean distance from land-based conflicts that might have destroyed or absorbed it. Vulnerable to the exact geological instabilities, volcanic activity and seismic events that could catastrophically destroy it. Now submerged in locations we've barely explored. The civilization's characteristics would have been shaped by its environment. Advanced shipbuilding and navigation, necessary for oceanic trade and communication. Sophisticated engineering for construction and irrigation, visible in what Plato described. Astronomical knowledge for navigation and calendar systems. Metallurgical capabilities. These aren't impossible or alien technologies. They're practical developments for a maritime culture with resources and stability to develop them. The scale was probably not the enormous empire Plato described. That's likely exaggeration or misunderstanding through translation and retelling. More realistic, a significant civilization comparable to contemporary late Pleistocene cultures, distinguished mainly by maritime focus and fortunate geographical position. Not global empire, but influential trading culture, reaching multiple coasts, spreading innovations through contact and exchange. The influence would have been cultural and technological rather than political. Maritime traders reaching Old and New World coasts, exchanging goods and ideas, spreading architectural techniques, astronomical knowledge, metallurgical methods. The cultural connections that explain global parallels in pyramid building, flood myths, serpent symbolism, astronomical alignments, not conquest but diffusion through contact. Religion and culture likely centered on oceanic themes, explaining the global prevalence of serpent and water deity associations. Astronomical observation, both for navigation and cosmological understanding, explaining widespread astronomical sophistication. Engineering knowledge, explaining architectural parallels. These elements spread through refugee populations after the civilization's destruction. The destruction came in stages. Younger Dryas cosmic impacts around 10,900 BCE initiated catastrophes, tsunamis, climate disruption, environmental collapse. The civilization survived, damaged but functional. Then around 9,600 BCE, rapid sea level rise combined with continued seismic and volcanic activity, mega tsunamis generated by submarine landslides or impacts, made the Atlantic islands uninhabitable. The final blow wasn't necessarily complete physical submergence, but rendering the environment unlivable for organized civilization. Survivors fled to multiple coastlines, Europe, Africa, possibly Americas. They brought knowledge and techniques, but arrived as refugees, not conquerors. They integrated into existing populations, taught what they remembered, influenced emerging cultures, but they didn't maintain separate identity. The catastrophe had been too complete, the losses too severe. They became part of host populations, their origins transforming into myth over generations. The civilization disappeared so completely because it was island-based. Cities and infrastructure most vulnerable to flooding now lie deep underwater. Refugees integrated rather than remaining distinct. The catastrophe was thorough enough that only distorted memories survived, preserved through oral tradition, transformed through retelling until the original facts became mythology. This reconstruction isn't fantasy. It's scenario grounded in evidence, constrained by what's possible, explaining the patterns we observe, an advanced but not impossible civilization. Destroyed by events we know occurred, refugees spreading knowledge, not alien intervention or mystical powers. Just human achievement, human catastrophe, and history we forgot because the evidence is underwater where we haven't looked. The obvious question deserves direct answer. If Atlantis existed as reconstructed, why haven't we found definitive proof? The challenges are systematic and substantial. Location is the first problem. Atlantis would be underwater, likely on the Azores Plateau or similar formation, at depths from 300 to 3,000 feet. This requires specialized equipment, remotely operated vehicles, advanced sonar systems. Comprehensive underwater archaeological survey is expensive. Most underwater archaeology focuses on shallow water, known historical sites, shipwrecks where location is documented. Deep water survey for speculative targets receives minimal resources. Preservation creates additional challenges. 12,000 years of submersion means sedimentation, covering structures, coral growth obscuring features, organic materials completely degraded. Only stone constructions would potentially survive detection. Underwater archaeology is challenging in shallow water. At depth, it becomes exponentially more difficult. Reading underwater features, distinguishing natural from artificial formations, requires expertise and extensive investigation. The sampling problem is severe. The Atlantic seafloor contains dozens of submerged plateaus and formations. Each requires extensive survey. We've examined barely a fraction. Most of the seafloor that was dry land during the Ice Age remains virtually unexplored archaeologically. Funding is scarce. Underwater archaeology receives tiny fraction of total archaeological funding. Proposals to search for Atlantis face skepticism that makes securing resources nearly impossible. Money flows toward less controversial projects with more certain results. The technology exists: advanced sonar, ROVs, submarine drones capable of deep water investigation, but it's deployed for commercial purposes. Oil exploration, cable laying, military applications. The cost of systematic archaeological survey is measured in millions per project, money not available for searching for something mainstream science considers fiction. The identification problem persists, even when unusual formations are discovered. Determining whether underwater features are artificial or natural is controversial, as debates over Bimini and Yonaguni demonstrate. Conservative interpretation favors natural explanations unless features are unambiguous. This bias is scientifically appropriate, but means ambiguous evidence gets dismissed rather than investigated thoroughly. Absence of evidence isn't compelling when we haven't looked. Searches conducted have been limited, unsystematic, underfunded. Multiple underwater discoveries have proven that submerged ancient structures exist and preserve for millennia. Dwarka, Pavlopetri, Black Sea settlements. Each discovery was initially dismissed as impossible until evidence became undeniable. What would actually resolve the question? Systematic bathymetric survey of Atlantic formations using modern high-resolution sonar. Targeted investigation of anomalies discovered. Core sampling and dating of formations. Commitment of resources comparable to major archaeological projects. The technology exists. The knowledge exists. What's missing is institutional will and funding. The failure to find Atlantis definitively stems more from not looking than from evidence of non-existence. Every decade of delay makes discovery harder, as sediment accumulates and structures degrade. The window for finding evidence might be closing. We haven't found it because we haven't truly searched. Not systematically. Not with resources we devote to finding oil or mapping seafloor for commercial purposes. You can't find what you're not searching for. And we've collectively decided not to search, based on certainty that seems premature given how little investigation has actually occurred. Finding Atlantis would change more than archaeological timelines. It would force reconsideration of human history, capability, and the nature of civilization itself. The immediate impact would be rewriting accepted chronology. Advanced civilization existed earlier than currently acknowledged. The Ice Age wasn't a primitive period, but potentially hosted sophisticated cultures. Modern civilization isn't humanity's first attempt at complex society, but possibly rebuilding after catastrophic loss. That shift alone undermines fundamental assumptions about linear human progress. For archaeology, it would validate interdisciplinary approaches, geology, climatology, and archaeology working together, rather than in isolation. Increased focus on underwater locations for understanding ancient history. Recognition that catastrophism, rapid dramatic changes, shaped human development more than gradualism. The field would need to reconsider its methods and assumptions. Understanding cultural connections would transform. Pyramid building, flood myths, Astronomical knowledge, technological parallels might be explained by diffusion from common source rather than independent invention. Ancient peoples were more connected, more capable, more sophisticated than currently credited. Dismissing them as primitive becomes untenable. Atlantis's destruction would teach uncomfortable lessons. Advanced civilizations are fragile. Natural catastrophes can erase them completely. Knowledge can be lost, requiring centuries to rediscover. Humanity has faced existential crises before. We might again. That's not comfortable knowledge, but it's important. Philosophical implications cut deeper. Our civilization's assumed superiority and uniqueness would be challenged. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but perhaps still climbing back to heights ancestors reached. That's humbling. It suggests human potential is greater than we recognize, but also that our achievements are less secure than we imagine. Our relationship with ancient peoples would change. Their knowledge traditions would deserve respect rather than dismissal as primitive mythology. Ancient accounts would be taken seriously as potential historical records. Oral traditions would be recognized as capable of preserving genuine historical memory across millennia. Indigenous knowledge would gain legitimacy. It's been denied. Practical implications would follow. Increased focus on catastrophe preparedness, recognizing civilization's vulnerability, greater investment in underwater archaeology and preservation, rethinking assumptions about what ancient peoples could achieve. These aren't abstract academic concerns. They affect how we understand ourselves and our future. The humbling effect matters most. Sophisticated civilizations can be destroyed so completely that later peoples doubt they existed. Much of human history has likely been permanently lost. Certainty about the past is often illusory. Accepting this requires intellectual humility that challenges modern assumptions about knowledge and progress. Whether or not Atlantis specifically is proven, the evidence points toward broader truth. Human history is more complex than mainstream narratives acknowledge. Ancient peoples were more capable than simplified timelines suggest. Our understanding is incomplete, possibly fundamentally flawed in places. Finding Atlantis wouldn't just answer one question. It would force us to ask dozens of new ones, to reconsider everything we thought we knew about where we came from and what we're capable of achieving or losing. That's why the question matters, regardless of the answer. Atlantis has survived over 2,000 years. That's longer than most religions, longer than most empires, longer than entire civilizations that rose and fell while this question persisted. Other ancient mysteries faded or found answers. Troy was discovered. El Dorado dissolved into legend. But Atlantis refuses to disappear. Every generation rediscovers it, debates it, searches for it. Why? The appeal isn't simple. Atlantis combines elements that resonate with fundamental human concerns. It represents lost perfection, a golden age when humanity allegedly achieved greatness before falling. This archetype appears repeatedly across cultures. Eden, Avalon, Shangri-La. The pattern suggests it addresses deep psychological needs, the desire to believe that better existed before, that we've fallen from something greater. But there might be more than psychology operating here. Human societies have repeatedly experienced catastrophic collapse. Civilizations have been destroyed, knowledge lost, populations scattered. At some level, perhaps collective, we know this can happen because it has happened. The idea of lost advanced civilizations might resonate not because we're romantics, but because we're remembering, however distantly, however distortedly. Atlantis serves as mirror. Each generation reimagines it according to contemporary concerns. Ancient Greeks saw cautionary tale about hubris. Renaissance thinkers saw ideal state. Victorian explorers saw archaeological prize waiting to be claimed. Modern seekers see evidence of ancient advanced technology or spiritual wisdom. This flexibility has enabled Atlantis to remain relevant across changing worldviews. It adapts, reflecting what each era fears and desires. Mystery itself holds appeal. The world feels completely mapped. Satellite imagery shows every square meter of Earth's surface. The internet makes information instantly accessible. Everything seems known, explained, catalogued. Atlantis represents one of the few remaining genuine mysteries, a question that still lacks definitive answer. That's psychologically satisfying in an age when mystery feels scarce. We need to believe unknown territories and undiscovered truths still exist. There's controversial appeal too. Pursuing Atlantis means questioning authority, challenging consensus, standing outside mainstream acceptance. This attracts personality types who value independent thinking over conformity. The outsider status becomes part of the allure, being right when the establishment is wrong, discovering what others refuse to see. But underneath all this is hope. If an advanced civilization existed and was lost, it means human potential is greater than we realize. Knowledge we've lost might be recovered. Our current civilization isn't the final word on human achievement. That's exciting, suggesting greater possibilities than accepted narratives allow. It's also unsettling, implying our achievements are less unique and secure than we imagine. Everything we've built could be lost as completely as Atlantis allegedly was. Atlantis persists, not despite lack of proof, but partly because of it. Mysteries that remain mysterious continue to fascinate. Questions definitively answered lose their allure. As long as the question remains open, the search continues. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps what matters isn't finding Atlantis, but what the search reveals about ourselves, our capabilities, our vulnerabilities, our need to believe in something greater, something lost, something waiting to be rediscovered. The quest for Atlantis has driven discovery in unexpected ways. Techniques developed for underwater archaeology, exploration methods, interdisciplinary approaches, much of this emerged from desires to find lost lands and sunken cities. The search for Atlantis contributed to the development of marine archaeology as a field. That has value regardless of whether Atlantis existed. Pursuing controversial theories sometimes leads to legitimate discoveries. Researchers searching for Atlantis have found actual unknown ancient sites. Underwater formations that might have been ignored received investigation because someone wondered if they could be Atlantis. Catastrophist theories about rapid geological changes and civilizational collapse, once dismissed entirely, have been validated by mounting evidence. The search pushed investigation into areas mainstream archaeology avoided. The Atlantis question promoted interdisciplinary thinking: geology, archaeology, mythology, climatology, genetics. Addressing this question requires combining multiple fields. That interdisciplinary approach has become more accepted in mainstream science, partly because fringe researchers demonstrated its value. The rigid boundaries between disciplines have softened. That's progress. We've learned about human capabilities. Ancient peoples were more sophisticated than traditional narratives credited. They possessed knowledge that was lost and required rediscovery. Oral traditions sometimes preserve genuine historical information despite scholarly dismissal. Each discovery that pushes back dates for human achievement, each finding of unexpected ancient sophistication, validates what Atlantis researchers have argued. We've underestimated our ancestors. Atlantis research has driven reconsideration of chronology. Dates for advanced human activities keep getting pushed backward. Ice Age peoples are recognized as capable of sophistication, not mere survivors. Catastrophic events have repeatedly reset human civilization. These aren't fringe ideas anymore. They're becoming mainstream recognition, partly because the search for Atlantis kept these possibilities alive when academia dismissed them. The controversy has illuminated how science actually works, the difference between healthy skepticism and dogmatic rejection, how paradigms resist change even when evidence accumulates, the role of career incentives and institutional inertia in shaping what questions get investigated. Understanding these limitations makes science stronger, not weaker. Recognizing bias helps correct for it. We've learned about memory and mythology. Myths often preserve genuine historical memories in distorted form. Flood narratives worldwide likely reflect real climatic catastrophes. Ancient accounts deserve more serious consideration as potential historical sources than automatic dismissal as primitive fantasy. This recognition changes how we read ancient texts and evaluate oral traditions. Pursuing Atlantis has kept alive awareness of civilization's fragility. Advanced societies can be destroyed, knowledge can be permanently lost. Natural catastrophes pose existential risks that shouldn't be dismissed as ancient history. This awareness has practical value for contemporary society, facing climate change, natural disasters, technological dependencies. We're not invulnerable. Previous civilizations learned that the hard way. Even if Atlantis is never definitively proven, the search has yielded valuable insights. Lost cities have been found. Ancient sophistication has been revealed. Timelines have been reconsidered. We've learned how human knowledge advances one uncomfortable question at a time, one challenged assumption at a time, one discovery that shouldn't exist according to established models, but does exist anyway. The journey has value even if the destination remains elusive. Sometimes searching matters more than finding. The central mystery remains. Was Plato describing a real civilization, a distorted memory of multiple events, or complete fiction? This documentary has presented evidence suggesting reality, but honest inquiry requires acknowledging the question stays open. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. The patterns are intriguing, not definitive. Uncertainty is intellectually honest when investigation is incomplete. Geography. If Atlantis existed, where exactly? The Azores Plateau seems most likely based on Plato's description and geological evidence. But other Atlantic seamounts, Caribbean formations, even some Mediterranean locations, can't be entirely ruled out without proper investigation. What evidence would distinguish between candidates? Systematic underwater survey, which hasn't occurred. Chronology. Was Plato's 9600 BCE dating accurate? The correlation with catastrophic geological events suggests yes. But should we consider other timeframes? Different dates would require different destruction mechanisms. The geological evidence supports Plato's timeline, but alternative scenarios deserve examination. Scale. Was Atlantis a major civilization comparable to ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, or a significant but more modest maritime culture? This matters because it determines what evidence we should expect. Major empire would leave more traces. Modest culture might disappear almost completely. Answering this affects how we search and what we search for. Influence. How extensively did Atlantis influence other cultures? Are global cultural parallels evidence of Atlantean diffusion, or independent invention, or something between? This question connects to broader debates about ancient cultural transmission versus convergent development. The answer has implications beyond Atlantis. Destruction. What exact combination destroyed Atlantis? Cosmic impacts seem likely contributors. Volcanism, earthquakes, rapid sea level rise all played roles. But the specific sequence, the relative importance of each factor, remains unclear. Was destruction instantaneous, or did it occur over decades? The mechanism matters for understanding what happened and what survived. Survival. Did refugees preserve and transmit knowledge? The appearance of sophisticated techniques in multiple post-catastrophe cultures suggests yes. But proving refugee transmission requires evidence we don't yet have. Genetic analysis might reveal population movements. Underwater archaeology might find migration routes. The question remains open. Evidence. What would constitute proof convincing mainstream scholarship? Architectural remains seem necessary, but would anything short of intact cities suffice? Has the bar for proof been set impossibly high? This methodological question affects how we evaluate claims and conduct research. Investigation. How should we study underwater sites while distinguishing natural from artificial formations? Protocols need to satisfy both proponents and skeptics. Methodological rigor matters. But so does willingness to investigate rather than dismiss. Finding balance is crucial. The broader question: what does the Atlantis controversy reveal about how we determine historical truth? Evidence, institutional authority, and consensus all shape accepted narratives. Understanding these dynamics helps evaluate not just Atlantis but any historical claim. These questions remain genuinely open. Dismissing them as settled is premature, given how little investigation has occurred in the most promising locations. Future research is necessary not just to satisfy curiosity, but to properly understand human history and civilization's vulnerability to catastrophe. The evidence exists somewhere. We just haven't found it yet, because we haven't truly looked. This documentary has presented evidence, theories, and questions. It cannot provide definitive answers because those answers don't yet exist. Perhaps they never will. Perhaps Atlantis will remain forever in this liminal space between possibility and proof, between memory and myth. And perhaps that's appropriate. Atlantis represents our greatest fear and our greatest hope. The fear that everything we build can be destroyed and forgotten, that civilizations rise and fall leaving barely a trace, that knowledge and achievement can be lost completely. The hope that human potential exceeds what we currently achieve. that our ancestors reached heights we're still climbing toward, that capabilities we consider modern might be rediscoveries of what was once known. Engaging with this mystery changes perspective. Ancient peoples appear more capable and wise than simplified narratives suggest. Modern civilization seems less permanent and unique than we'd like to believe. Human history reveals itself as more complex and mysterious than comfortable certainties allow. These shifts in perspective have value regardless of whether Atlantis existed. Questioning mainstream narratives matters. Not because all alternative theories are correct, most aren't, but because questions that aren't asked cannot be answered. Progress requires willingness to challenge comfortable assumptions, even when those challenges make us uncomfortable. The balance is crucial. Healthy skepticism prevents belief in every fringe theory. But excessive skepticism becomes dogma that blocks investigation of genuine questions. Think independently. Evaluate evidence on its merits. Recognize that lack of mainstream acceptance doesn't determine truth, but neither does contrarian rejection of mainstream knowledge. Being uncertain is intellectually honest when evidence is incomplete. Living with uncertainty, accepting that some questions may never be definitively answered, finding value in investigation, even without resolution, these are marks of mature thinking. Historical mysteries allow connection with deep human past. They provide perspective on present circumstances. They remind us that much about existence remains unknown despite our technological sophistication. Mystery serves important psychological and philosophical purposes. Not everything needs to be explained. Not everything can be. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, whether single civilization or composite memory, whether precisely where Plato said or somewhere unexpected, has served humanity for millennia as mirror. It reflects our hopes and fears about what we can achieve and what we can lose. It persists because we need it to persist, because it asks questions we need to keep asking. This is invitation. Maintain curiosity about the past. Question assumptions about what's possible. Recognize the fragility and potential of civilization. Keep asking uncomfortable questions that might reveal uncomfortable truths. The world needs people willing to investigate rather than accept, to question rather than dismiss, to look where others refuse to see. Maybe we'll find Atlantis. Maybe we won't. But the search makes us better historians, better thinkers, more honest about what we don't know, and more humble about what we think we know. Perhaps the real value isn't finding Atlantis, but what we become through searching, more curious, more critical, more aware of our place in the long arc of human experience. Sometimes the questions matter more than the answers. Sometimes the journey is the destination. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, the mysteries that remain mysterious are exactly what we need.